3 minutes after 10 is the time. A very good morning indeed to you. Just pause for a moment and focus on the moment, actually. Because something absolutely crucial is happening as we speak. Something fascinating and important and probably inevitable. And that is that the BBC and other outlets are reporting the final disgrace of Boris Johnson as if there are two sides. Something that Boris Johnson knew they would do. He knew they would have to do, which is why I was reading his response to the report before the report had actually been published. It was embargoed until the publication of the report. And what it means is that the news agenda gets seeded with his pathetic attempts at exculpating himself, even before this absolutely monumental wedge of evidence against him has seen the light of day. In many ways, if this is the end of his career, and it's tempting, I think, to believe that it is, in many ways, the end of his career contains the explanation for all of it. False equivalence, bogus balance, blatant lies, epic hypocrisy, and constantly accusing the other side, in this case, ardent Brexiteer and Conservative knight Sir Bernard Jenkin, accusing the other side of doing all of the things that you yourself have done and yet deny. It's actually incredible. It only occurred to me as the light came on. I wasn't quite sure, I never am, how I was going to open up our conversation this morning. But that suddenly occurred to me because, as you know, I have the screens in front of me and everyone has to do it like this, except us. For some reason, I still haven't completely understood. Everyone has to pretend there are two sides to this story. Everyone has to pretend that Boris Johnson's behaviour is somehow defensible, even though the sovereign parliament, the checks and balances, the constitutional investigation into what he has done has concluded that he is as guilty as sin. Something that everybody honest already knew. But we have to do two sides. We have to invite Andrea Leadsom on to talk about why the bloke who runs the World Trade Organization understands less about the World Trade Organization than Andrea Leadsom does. We have to invite on Nigel Lawson to explain why all the scientists on climate change are wrong and Nigel Lawson and his friends in Tufton Street are correct. We have to invite governors of the Bank of England or heads of epic international economic organisations on to talk about economic situations. And then we have to invite some pilot from the Institute of Economic Affairs on to offer up an alternative view. That's why we are where we are. And Boris Johnson is proving that this morning in a way that is, frankly, inevitable and remarkable at the same time. Front page of the Daily Telegraph today is trying to claim that Liz Truss is about to be proved right about the economy. That, of course, after tanking £32 billion worth of it. So don't for a minute think that the problems disappear with Boris Johnson. Don't for a minute think that when Boris Johnson shuffles off this political coil, we can start the business of getting back to normal or restoring a semblance of, to coin a three-word phrase, professionalism, accountability and integrity. All right, 4 words, but you know what I mean. Because we're still in it. We're still in this mess. We're still in a country where the levers of political and media power are held exclusively by people who thought Brexit would be a good idea. And the truth can't reach the people until their hands are prized off those levers. So if you were expecting joy today or celebration, I'm afraid you're going to be disappointed. Today is a day to take pride in parliamentary democracy. It's a day perhaps to allow yourself a sigh of relief that one of the foulest cankers ever to pollute the body politic has apparently been removed in circumstances so complete that even he would struggle, although he will try. Be sure he will try. He has already tried to pretend that things are not as bad as they seem, or that he is a liar more sinned against than sinning, or that there is somehow a counter to his condemnation. There just isn't. There just isn't. But even after all these years, even after Trump and Johnson and Brexit, the media model and the political framework is not capable of recognising this reality. It has to pretend there are two sides. Even now, oh, here's Boris Johnson's resignation letter. Let's invite someone onto the programme to defend Boris Johnson. It's a bit like getting Harold Shipman's mum on the show to talk about how he did a bang-up job looking after kids with tonsillitis and that we should weigh that against his epic crimes. Where else does the guilty get corners of the media queuing up to claim that they've been badly treated? Where else does a man found by a jury of his peers to be beyond contempt, and indeed in contempt, where else can he rely upon corners of a supposedly impartial media dedicating themselves to finding people prepared to put his side of the story, or prepared to pretend that his version of events might contain a single scintilla of truth, when every single day, every week, every month, every year of his entire life, whether in public or in private, has proved time and time and time again that he lies like the rest of us breathe. He lies to his wives, he lies to his mistresses, he lies to his colleagues, he lies to his constituents, he lies to the House of Commons, he lies about lying to the House of Commons. He lies to his party leaders, he lies to his employers, he lies to every single person that he ever comes into contact with. And yet today you can still turn your telly on or your radio on or open up a newspaper and find somebody pretending that this time he's not lying. He lies to Nadine Dorries, bless her little cotton socks. She's struggling at the moment to remember what the meaning of the words "with immediate effect" actually are. So bent is she by her continuing loyalty to a man who will lie about anything and everything, even the things you think that nobody would dare to lie about. I'm reminded of, is it Billy Bunter, covered in crumbs, denying that he's eaten any cake, covered in pie juice, wrapped around his chops like Christian Dior lipstick, pretending that he has. I haven't eaten any pie. You've literally got pie falling out of your mouth, Bunter. I haven't eaten any pie. It's all Bernard Jenkins' fault. Anyway, I heard Bernard Jenkins ate a pie once. It's absolutely incredible how completely Boris Johnson's latest travail proves the depth of the damage done to this country, the depth of it, the sheer extent of it. The people in this profession who've spent a decade tickling his toes. Without that, of course, none of this could have happened. You're talking about a prime minister standing up in the House of Commons and lying through his teeth time and time and time again. Lying about events that were unfolding when the rest of us couldn't even kiss our mothers. Parties, puke being cleaned from the corridors of Downing Street, children's swings being broken by carousing colleagues, lie after lie after lie after lie. And even now they try to tell you it doesn't really matter and we've all moved on and it was only a bit of cake and nobody really cares. And it all matters. And what perhaps matters most is the complicity. The people responsible for telling him to stop. The people responsible for telling you what he was really like. The people who thought he's just a good bloke. Oh, he's just a bit of fun. Oh, good old Boris. He shouldn't be held to the same rules that everybody else should be held to. Absolutely shameful that my profession is still populated by people who have spent the best part of a decade treating him like some sort of messiah, when anybody with an ounce of integrity, honesty or professionalism could see that he was a disgusting, despicable liar who has disgraced this country, disgraced our parliament and disgraced our politics. And it doesn't go away with him because they still edit the papers. They still cow in the corridors of the BBC, worried that the right-wing media might turn on them if they offer up an honest account of what Boris Johnson has done and where he is today. Absolutely incredible. Front page of the Mail today, astonishing Partygate twist. Boris's Tory accuser went to wife's birthday drinks party in lockdown. A supposed newspaper of record approaching the imminent revelation that an actual Prime Minister embarked upon a course of behaviour so completely unprecedented and despicable that a jury of his own peers recommends a suspension from the House of 90 days. Count them, 90 days. The removal of the pass that is normally a prerequisite for all former MPs. And the Daily Mail is focusing on a bunch of nonsense from a far-right blog. Absolutely ridiculous and yet utterly of a piece with the mess that we've been led into by these people. Turn your telly on Sunday morning. Laura Kuenssberg will probably be pretending that Boris Johnson has simply faced quite a charge. That's quite a charge that you've laid against the Prime Minister. The Select Committee, populated by a majority of Conservatives, has made quite a charge against the Conservative Prime Minister. And here's Guito Harry to offer up a defence of the man. Absolutely incredible. And you wonder why we are where we are? Well, that's why. People can't see the wood for the trees. People can't see the truth for the lies. People can't see the importance of parliamentary sovereignty and parliamentary democracy because they've spent the last 7 years pretending that it was somehow compromised by being in the European Union. They are too stupid to understand how ridiculous they look this morning because they use words that they do not understand the meaning of. So put the champagne back in the fridge. It's not time to celebrate, it's time to ruminate on how the hell this happened and how it can continue to happen. How I can turn now to pretty much any screen in the country, or turn on pretty much any other radio programme in the country, or open up pretty much any newspaper in the country and find people still prepared not just to defend him, but to pretend that he is the victim of a witch hunt, that he is the victim of a hit job, that he is the victim of a smear campaign. It's not normal what's happened to this country. It's not normal and it's not right. And almost everybody whose name you know in the field of politics and media bears some responsibility for what has happened. So put the champagne back in the fridge. Put this pathetic attempt at poo-pooing the findings of an independent Commons Select Committee populated by a majority of Conservative MPs. Put it in the bin. Put it through the shredder. Put him where he belongs, in disgrace, in the corner, forevermore. And stop pretending that there are two sides to every story. We don't do it elsewhere in life. We know what's right, we know what's wrong, we know what's good, we know what's bad, we know what's true, we know what's false. We know what Boris Johnson is. Some of us always have. It's 10:15. 17 minutes after 10, we've just had to get smelling salts for Keith because I brought the introduction in bang on time, possibly for the first time this year, and on a day when people were taking bets about whether we'd drive a coach and horses through Monday's monologue, which lasted 43 minutes. But there are other things to get on with today. Here's just one thought for you before Ben Kentish starts steering us through some of the key findings of this report. And I should tell Ben, I'm not interested in the response from Boris Johnson. And I shall explain why. It's because when people are found guilty, it's not the guilty that stands on the steps of the court offering up his account of why the verdict was wrong. When people are about to be carted away in disgrace, they don't get to stand on the steps of the Old Bailey and explain why the jury got it wrong or why the judge got it wrong or why the sentence is unfair. When the guilty are found guilty, they are required under our justice system to stay silent, at least until they're released, at which point they can write a book and get signed up by the Daily Mail. But they don't get to offer up their defence or their account. They do that to the committee, they do that to the jury, they do that to the court. And the court or the jury or the committee decides what has happened and what shall be done. When Boris Johnson released his response to the Privilege Committee report this morning, before the Privilege Committee report has been published, he was probably already in contempt. Certainly his early attempts to address the findings before the findings had been published have been found by the committee to have compounded the contempt. It is as if every single thing he does is proof that the findings are correct. But of course, by getting it out there early, he creates the false equivalence. He creates the mythical seesaw, which has balances at both ends. He creates the idea that there is somehow an answer or a response or a counter to what is now fact. Because this is not an opinion, this report from the Privilege Committee, it is counting. Ben Kentish, where do we even begin?
Well, James, it's explosive, it's eviscerating. It is, I think, very likely the end of Boris Johnson's political career. This committee of MPs, Tory majority committee of MPs, asked to look at whether Boris Johnson's mistakes in Parliament when he insisted that there were no breaches of the law were a genuine mistake but one arising from recklessness, or whether they were a deliberate lie. They conclude repeatedly that the latter is the case, that Boris Johnson deliberately and knowingly lied to Parliament and lied to the committee. They say this, James: we came to the view that some of Mr. Johnson's denials and explanations were so disingenuous that they were by their very nature deliberate attempts to mislead the committee and the House, while others demonstrated deliberation because of the frequency with which he closed his mind to the truth. They say for these reasons we conclude that Mr. Johnson's conduct was deliberate and that he has committed a serious contempt of the House. James, they go further. They don't just accuse him of misleading the House of Commons. They accuse him of misleading the committee itself, the Privileges Committee itself, of breaching confidence, of impugning the committee and thereby undermining the democratic process of the House, and of being complicit in the campaign of abuse and attempted intimidation of the committee. So severe are these findings, so serious these flaws, these failings, that they say that if Boris Johnson was still a member of the House of Commons, he should be suspended for 90 days, 3 months, the second longest suspension for any MP in history. And they recommend that given he's no longer an MP, he should not be entitled to the former member's parliamentary pass that almost all former MPs are entitled to. Now, they make these conclusions having been through and looked at 6 gatherings, at least 5 of which Boris Johnson attended. They look at what happened, they look at whether rules were followed, and they look at what Boris Johnson said in defending his insistence that at all times the rules were followed. They go and look at the birthday cake gathering for which Boris Johnson received a fixed penalty notice, for example, and conclude that Boris Johnson should not. There was nothing to suggest that was in keeping with the rule. James, they come up with this phrase.
His wife and his interior decorator were there.
Mr. Johnson was also unable to explain why he considered his wife and interior designer absolutely necessary participants, quotes, in a work-related meeting. Pretty damning. Others, Lee Kane, the former Director of Communications, his leaving do, for example. And this is quite key, James, because this is the point they come to time and time again. They say this: in view of Mr. Johnson's repeated exhortations to the public to follow the rules and guidance, we do not believe that, asked at the time whether socially distanced, quote, leaving dues to maintain staff morale were permitted under the rules and guidance at the time, he would have advised the British public that they were. In trying to prove and conclude that Boris Johnson knew that these were against the rules, that's something they lean on quite a lot. If Boris Johnson was asked at the time, is what you're doing what the rest of the country is allowed to do, they conclude that he would have said no, and therefore that he knew this was against the rules.
That's the bit, isn't it? That's fantastically identified, because we have been explaining for years on this programme that there comes a point where you can't prove somebody's lying, because you cannot prove the contents of their mind. And he's done this throughout his life. Abusive and cheating partners do it to their spouses. It's called gaslighting, when you try and convince your partner that she's going mad and that you're not having an affair. I don't know if he does that in his private life, but it's a helpful analogy because he's done it to the country. We're going mad. I'm not, and you can't prove it. And there's 2 giveaways in the original response that put him in contempt when he started talking about how they claim to be able to read my mind, and in the one that we're not going to talk about today, where he actually uses the phrase Mystic Meg. It's as if he is unwittingly admitting a lifetime tactic of pushing the denial to the point where, unless you can actually prove what's going on in his mind, then you can't conclusively and definitively prove that he's lying. But what the committee have done is take his behaviour as a lens through which to read his mind. This is the brilliance of the, I don't know if you'd call it jurism, but the brilliance of it is that you cannot claim that you believed this because you were doing that.
Well, on the one hand, James, he was asked, was what you were doing in keeping with the guidance? And he said, absolutely, I firmly believed it was, and I still believe it was. Then he was asked, would you have at that time advised other people that they could do this? And even he himself in that committee hearing did not say, yes, of course I would have told the rest of the country that it was important they hold staff leaving dues in order to raise morale. And the language, I mean, I don't think I've ever seen language like this in a parliamentary report. I don't want to bore you too much, but some of the phrasing...
You're not going to bore me today.
It's really... Mr. Johnson is adamant that he believed all of the events which he attended and of which he had direct knowledge were essential. That belief, which he continues to assert, this is all quotes, James, had no reasonable basis in the rules or in the facts. A reasonable person looking at the events would not have had the belief that Mr. Johnson has professed. And they go on to accuse him basically of what you are, James. They suggest very clearly, they don't suggest it, they state it, that he made this up to try to cover up what he knew were breaches of the law. They say we conclude that Mr. Johnson's persistence in putting forward this unsustainable interpretation of the guidance is both disingenuous and a retrospective contrivance to mislead the House and mislead the committee. They quote a former junior official in Downing Street saying, Number 10, despite setting the rules to the country, was slow to enforce any rules in the building. Social distancing was not enforced. This was all part of a wider culture of not adhering to any rules. Number 10 was like an island oasis of normality. And it goes on like that. You like this, James. Even in the evidence he gave to the committee, Boris Johnson got things wrong. He claimed that one of the events that he thought was necessary to raise staff morale, because, to quote him, the cabinet secretary had just stepped down. Turned out the event that he was talking about was weeks before the cabinet secretary actually stepped down. He then had to admit that. They say this was incorrect. The cabinet secretary did not resign until the 29th of June 2020. So even in the evidence that he's using to defend some of these gatherings, the committee says some of the facts just simply don't stack up. And just finally,
I just want to pick up on a couple of things, if I may. The first is the unanimous vote for these suspensions, with one exception from the SNP MP who called for him. I think Beth Rigby on Sky News' autocorrect was working overtime this morning because she credited him with calling for the explosion of Boris Johnson, which may,
his political career may have
but so there was an expulsion. So any attempts to malign Harriet Harman or Bernard Jenkin are meaningless, because it was a unanimous vote from a Tory majority committee. And anyone in the media pretending that there is a sort of counterbalance, or I'm not expecting you to comment on this, you still have to stay friends with these people, but anyone expecting the media claiming counterbalance or inviting Michael Fabricant or Gitto Harry to talk about it, they're not going to mention the fact that it's a unanimous decision from a committee made up with a Tory majority from which Chris Bryant had recused himself in the first place. So what do we know already, and I appreciate it's 30,000 words and no one can get through it there, about the likelihood or evidence of his evidence being contradicted by the colleagues he'd claimed had told him that he was telling the truth? That might be the next thing for us to look at, that idea that he was saying, I was constantly informed that this was that, because it seems unlikely, doesn't it, that the people he claimed were telling him have said to the committee, no, we didn't.
Yes, that's right, James. He claims that he was repeatedly assured that no rules were broken. The committee looks into whether he was given repeated reassurances that no rules were broken. They conclude that he wasn't. They conclude that was only in relation to one event on the 18th of December. That was the where Boris Johnson was briefly and initially assured that by senior members of his team that no rules were broken. The suggestion is that he went into the House of Commons and then said no rules were broken. Yeah. He then claimed he was talking about only that event, but everybody else interpreted it. Parliament, the media, his colleagues interpreted it as that, saying
because it's
no
always
rules
worked.
were broken.
It's always worked in the past. You could even see it at the doorstep, when Sky doorstepped him at the airport the other day, and they're just presenting him with evidence, and he tries to turn it into a sort of a jokey exchange. No, you said that. No, I said that. No, and it's always worked. And yet somehow in front of this committee it just didn't. Probably because it was a jury of his peers, and they've seen it all before, and they would not be tickling his toes, as many members of the media have done, or making astonishing excuses, defending the indefensible, as many politicians have done. It's hard to pick a moment. Probably the one when he said there weren't any media here, and the dad at the hospital pointed at the cameras that were actually filming the exchange in which he said there weren't any media here. The juggernaut of nonsense just crashed.
Well, it's a pretty thin defence. That's one of the thinnest parts of it, James, to be frank, because if you go into the House of Commons and you say, I have repeatedly been assured that all rules were followed in Downing Street, and then months later you say, I was only talking about that being the case on one day, then not a great surprise, I think, that the committee found that retrospective explanation that actually what you'd said, you were only talking about one specific event, didn't really stand up to scrutiny, when his spokespeople were also saying on the record the rules were followed at all times. Now, clearly that wasn't the case. Boris Johnson, they say, not only should have known that wasn't the case, but did know that wasn't the case, and therefore lied, and in refusing to accept those findings and turning his guns, as you say, absolutely and sort of mercilessly on the members of that committee. They say that amounts to a serious further contempt. They say the attack on a committee carrying out its remit from the democratically elected House itself amounts to an attack on our democratic institutions. We consider these statements completely unacceptable, and in our mind, together with the egregious breach of confidentiality, is a serious further contempt. So even right at the very end of his long parliamentary career, even in his resignation statement, Boris Johnson, going out of politics, at least for now, by committing a further contempt of Parliament.
Trashing Parliament. That's the irony for those of us attuned to such things. These are the people who've spent the last 7 years talking about sovereignty, talking about the supremacy of Parliament or the purity of democracy or the importance of accountability. We can't be in the European Union because we need to be in control, we need to be in charge. And he is running away, absolutely trashing precisely the institutions, the checks, the balances that prove the sovereignty and the supremacy of Parliament. As the committee points out, it is a committee from a democratically elected House. Whether or not people like Zach Goldsmith, who are doing distraction for Boris Johnson this morning, are bright enough to understand this, or whether or not they are dissembling and deceiving on his behalf, I do not know. But I do know this. It wouldn't be happening if Zach Goldsmith, of course, came off the back of running a racist mayoral campaign and then managed to lose his seat in the House of Commons twice before Boris Johnson put him in the House of Lords. I forget where the free holidays that he gives Johnson and his wife fit into that chronology. But very briefly, that recall bill that would have seen Johnson hauled back to Uxbridge and Ruislip to face the judgment of a Conservative majority constituency, that was Zach Goldsmith doing.
Yes, he was very involved in that, James. That's I know we're out of time, but that's a really important point. The Privileged Committee has no power of its own. It's commissioned by the House of Commons. It reports to the House of Commons. The House of Commons then has a vote on whether or not to approve it. Even if they'd approved the 3-month suspension that the Privileges Committee is now saying it would have liked to have seen, that doesn't mean that Boris Johnson's forced out of Parliament. His constituents then have to trigger a recall petition. He can then stand again in the subsequent by-election. It's only his constituents that could have ever removed him from the House of Commons, and any suggestion that the Privileges Committee or even the House of Commons itself could have done that is simply not true.
Not that will stop him and his cheerleaders, his capped offers and forelock tuggers claiming the polar opposite of the observable truth, because it was ever thus. Ben, I suspect we'll be hearing from you again in the course of this morning. The time is 10:32. Thomas Watts is here now with your headline. It is 10:35. So those 5 points, those 5 findings, deliberately misleading the House, obviously. We knew that already. Deliberately misleading the committee. It was a given, wasn't it, really? Because unless he's going to admit to deliberately misleading the House, then he's going to have to deliberately mislead the committee. Breaching confidence. That happened on Friday when he responded to the report before it was being published, despite knowing all too well that he wasn't allowed to. Let's focus on that then first. And phone lines are open, by the way. 0345 6060 973 is the number you need. The more, the bigger the story sometimes, the harder it is to zone in upon the right question to ask. So I sometimes absolve myself of all responsibility to come up with the right question and just invite you to ring in from whatever angle you please. But I am going to allow myself to ask this now. Is it over? Can we actually relax a bit? I wouldn't celebrate. It's a bit like when you're watching a horror film and you think that must be it now. They've finally vanquished the vampire, haven't they? They've finally got rid of the monster. And then you check your watch to see how much of the film is left, because you're aware of the possibility that he might come crashing out of the cellar with a pickaxe poking out of his head or whatever it may be. What is the feeling in your mind now that the gig is up? I mean, you look at the dwindling band of supporters. You can tell people in the media are very flat this morning, not quite sure where to go, not quite sure what to do, what to talk about. If you'd spent 10 years tickling this bloke's toes, you'd probably just want to go and hide in a fridge for the foreseeable future. But actually defending him, you've basically got Nadine Dorries, Jacob Rees-Mogg and Michael Fabricant. It's a bit like a medieval military scene where the pretender to the throne arrives outside Salisbury and sticks his standard in the field and calls the country to arms, waiting to see who will turn up to help him launch a campaign against the king. And Nadine Dorries, Michael Fabricant and Jacob Rees-Mogg turn up. Rees-Mogg brought a horse, just in case. That's it. And he's standing there waving his little flag. All right, the Sun is still going to be shilling for him, and the Mail and a few people in the broadcast media, no doubt, and those weird new TV stations that have been set up largely to cope with a situation like this. Such is the effort required to continue pushing back against reality. But I, Boris Johnson, have raised my standard on the field. Come one, come all. And Michael Fabricant, Nadine Dorries, Jacob Rees-Mogg and Gitto Harry turn up. That's it. That's your army, lads. That's your doughty defenders of Boris Johnson's honour. Is there a moment? I mean, some people presumably are irredeemable. But is there a moment for others who fell under his spell, who believed his lies, or possibly excused his lies? I don't, in all honesty, believe that anyone believed him, if you see what I mean. You just felt that he didn't need to be held to the same account, to the same standards that everybody else had to be held to. He sort of deserved a free pass. Good old Boris. Oh, don't bog him down with things like honesty, integrity, professionalism and accountability. He's a one-off. He's our guy. We don't mind if he does this. You see it with Trump. You know you do. Trump obviously enjoys support from evangelical Christians in America, which is pretty much the picture you'd see if you looked up hypocrisy in a dictionary. But does that break now? Or do they accept the invitation to start attacking the jury? Because I keep coming back to this point, that the absolute fracture in the political media landscape is the fact that the guilty man still gets to present his case as if it's a counterbalance to the verdict. That does not happen in any other context, possibly in any other country, although one was reminded of some of Berlusconi's excesses when he passed away earlier this week. You don't get to stick a microphone, whether metaphorical or real, in front of the people claiming that the guilty party has been framed or is innocent or is more sinned against than sinning. You might, in the passing weeks, months, years, hear whisperings of injustice or grievance, but on the day that the verdict is handed down, to treat the guilty as an equal and opposite force to the judge and the jury is obviously ridiculous. And yet on it goes. It's still happening. 20-11 is the time. So that was the third bit, the breach of confidence. The fact that he knew when he did this bit's nasty, impugning the committee and thereby undermining the democratic process of the House. This is the bit where I wonder whether the fanboys and fangirls are actually bright enough to understand how stupid he's made them look. Because they've pretended after Brexit fell apart that it was never actually about 350 million quid for the NHS or about money or cheaper food or cheap shoes for peasants or all the things that Jacob Rees-Mogg and Nadine Dorries and David Davis and the rest of them told you that you'd get. When you realised that you weren't going to get them, they thought you'd swallow the idea that what you really wanted all along was blue passport, sovereignty and a supreme British Parliament. And yet here is your boy Boris Johnson attacking the supremacy of Parliament, attacking the fundamental sovereignty of Parliament via the select committee process, calling it a kangaroo court. That is disgusting. That is impugning the committee and thereby undermining the democratic process of the House. That's not an opinion. That's counting. And then fifth, being complicit in the campaign of abuse and attempted intimidation of the committee. It's almost as if when Jacob Rees-Mogg went to Scotland to lie to the Queen about the unlawful prorogation of Parliament, it's almost as if someone should have realised that he probably didn't care that much about parliamentary democracy or about the purity of Parliament or about sovereignty. Hang on a minute. The guy who went to Scotland to lie to the Queen about the unlawful prorogation of Parliament, you're still inviting him onto your programmes to drawl incomprehensibly about how important the institutions are and then drop some Latin into the conversation in the hope of covering up the fact that he's as thick as Minsus Maximus. It's almost as if someone should have noticed that he probably wasn't telling the truth when he claimed to care deeply about these traditions. In fact, I'll tell you what would be too much to be true. If the same bloke that went to Scotland to unlawfully prorogue Parliament turned out to be the bloke who led the campaign to get Owen Paterson off the hook after he was found to have breached parliamentary standards, be the same bloke who's been invited into studios to drawl incomprehensibly about tradition and the importance of constitutional checks and balances. But that'd be weird, wouldn't it? Right? And then if he turned out also to be one of the people using the phrase kangaroo court and thereby impugning the committee, undermining the democratic process and being complicit in the campaign of abuse and attempted intimidation of the committee, one person, I'll tell you what, that would be too much to be true. What, the same guy prorogued Parliament and lied to the Queen about the unlawful prorogation of Parliament? The same guy lied to the Queen about the unlawful prorogation of Parliament? Led the campaign to get Owen Paterson off the hook when he broke the rules by trying to rip up the rule book? The same guy did those two things? God. And then he was one of the people that impugned the committee, undermined the democratic process, and was complicit in the campaign of abuse and attempted intimidation of the committee. The same guy did all those three things? God, it's too much to believe almost. I'll tell you what would really be the cherry on the icing on that cake. Imagine if Boris Johnson had tried to give him a knighthood. Imagine that. Imagine if the same person who lied to the Queen about the unlawful prorogation of Parliament led the campaign to rip up the rule book in order to get Owen Paterson out of trouble for breaking all the rules, and impugned the committee, undermined the democratic process, and was complicit in the campaign of abuse and attempted intimidation of the committee, all while claiming, in his ludicrous fake drawl, that he cares passionately about sovereignty or the supremacy of Parliament or constitutional history or checks and balances or accountability and integrity. Imagine if the bloke that did those three terrible things, while claiming that he believed in the opposite, was somehow given a knighthood by Boris Johnson. Wouldn't that be just too much to believe? Gosh, I'm sure that you could rely upon your favourite neighbourhood newspaper or broadcaster to point out how absolutely disgusting that would be for one individual who claims to somehow represent enthusiasm for and faith in parliamentary sovereignty and parliamentary democracy and indeed the monarchy, for the same person to go to Scotland to lie to the Queen about the unlawful prorogation of Parliament, to lead a campaign to rip up the Parliamentary Standards Rulebook after his mate Owen Paterson was found to have broken the Parliamentary Standards rules, and then to impugn the committee, the Privileges Committee, to undermine the democratic process of the House of Actual Commons, to be complicit in the campaign of abuse and attempted intimidation of that committee. The same person would do all those three things and then get a knighthood off Boris Johnson? Oh, well, thank goodness we don't live in that country. It is 10:48 and you are listening to James O'Brien on LBC. As people sift through 30,000 words of evidence, 30,000 words of report, nuggets are emerging. The additional evidence section throwing up at least one whistleblower. We'll get onto that shortly. But first, we're joined by Chris Bryant, current chair of the Standards Committee, former chair of the Privileges Committee. You should remind us, Chris, if you would, why you stepped down as chair of the Privileges Committee.
Well, because I had said repeatedly, including I think on your programme, that I thought that Boris Johnson had deliberately lied to Parliament about these matters. So,
well, you must be feeling pretty silly this morning then.
Well, I actually feel quite sad. Yes. It's funny, partly because I've seen his rants today, and Boris Johnson's rant today, and it's part Kenneth Williams, part Donald Trump.
Yes.
It's just I think he looks like a little lost boy.
Mm.
He never had a character that was right to be Prime Minister, and he's brought all of this on himself. But look, I mean, the report is stunning. It's and I think every member of the committee deserves a medal, if not a pension for life or something, because they've stuck by their guns and they've followed the evidence.
They've refused to be intimidated as well, which cannot be guaranteed. Plenty of people in this country quite cowed by the sort of attacks that the committee has been exposed to. When you use the word stunning, what would you say is most stunning?
Well, I'd always thought that they might think he didn't deliberately lie, but he was just very careless with the truth. But the way they lay it out, line after line after line, all the evidence, it takes quite a lot to read it all and stick it all in your mind. But the way they lay it out is absolutely clear. It was deliberate. It wasn't accidental. It was deliberate. And that's what they find in 14 different ways, on 14 different occasions. So it's like, we've never had a moment like this. Stanley Baldwin lied in 1937 about whether we had enough airplanes to defeat Hitler. Yes. But it was just one lie, and he corrected it 3 months later, and everybody said, "Oh, all right, fine." Anthony Eden lied, didn't he, in the 1950s? But that was all washed away when a general election happened, and so on. But this is so iconic, I think, in our British history. We will remember this day, and he will go down in history as the liar-in-chief.
And A-level students will be studying elements of what's happening this morning, long after we've ceased to draw breath, Chris Bryant. What does it
and I think people are surprised that they went for 90 days. Yeah. I heard lots of MPs were telling me, "Oh no, they'll go for 5 days." I mean, blah, blah, blah. No, they weren't for 90 days. And of course, the way he's behaved throughout has made it worse. It's worth remembering that, the committee was set up when he was Prime Minister.
Yes.
Literally, he appointed the 4 Conservative members of the committee.
That's been rather overlooked in some of the coverage this morning, isn't it? I think we're going to lose the line. That's it. We only booked one guest this morning and we've lost him already. Try and get Chris Bryant back up, because there are a couple of other things that I want to put to him. In the meantime, the spotlight passes. I've got this astonishing revelation from effectively a whistleblower, filed in additional evidence. Oh, Chris Bryant is back. So, Chris, apologies. I think the phone line went down. Where were we?
It's the Russians.
It is probably, yes. It's either the Russians or Nadine
or
Dorries.
Murdoch.
It's one or the other. We're trying on this programme to avoid the temptation to discuss this as if there are two sides to the story. It's pretty pathetic, frankly, to see most of the media still pursuing this as if it's a seesaw and there are weights on both sides. It's essentially a political court.
Oh, well, hang on. I mean, there's...
Go on. Oh, forget it. We lost you again. Go on, one more chance. What were you saying? No, there we go. Technology defeats us. I'm pretty sure Noel in Oxford will be on a stronger line, on a secure line. 10:53 is the time. Might be a record, this. 10:53 before I've taken a call, and Noel gets the honour. Noel, what made you pick up the phone?
Hello, James.
Hello. Where are we?
Good morning, Chair. Yes, can you hear me okay?
Loud and clear, mate. What's on your mind?
Yeah, well, there's an awful lot. I mean, you said most of it. You had me laughing at some of it. But, it's encouraging to see, like you said, that the committee, held a nerve. So many people haven't,
yes,
in the face of Johnson's antics. But you can never take these things in isolation, James. I think you have to go back and, you're almost looking at a cabal or a gang or a little sort of group of mafia. I mean, you go back to his Oxford days and the group he surrounded himself, like Cameron and that other,
Do you think it's over?
I'd like to think he is, but I don't have enough faith in man and womankind, I think, because he'll use the old charm again. There's enough rotten people in the Tory government, especially in this current group, to make excuses, constantly make excuses. And, it's like with Johnson, he's convinced himself, regardless of how many lies, whatever, even calling into question, the credibility of the President of the United States, Barack Obama, and, clapping for the nurses when they saved his life, and then, high-fiving people when he kept their wage prices down. People have short memories, unfortunately, and I think, there's
I can't see it. I mean, I never say never, and we've had 7 years of thinking that must be the bottom of the barrel. Surely they can't scrape any lower than that, and then along come the scrapers to scrape ever lower. But that what Chris Bryant touched on there was fascinating. And we talked about it with Ben Kentish as well. This idea that the trick failed. The biggest tool in his arsenal, and I'm not talking about Jacob Rees-Mogg, the biggest tool in his arsenal, the denial of observable reality, because, well, you can't read my mind. You don't know what I was thinking. I must have said to you on this programme dozens of times, that's the point at which he gets away with it, because normal people don't operate like that. Normal people found with pie crust all around their chops admit that they've eaten a pie. They don't stand there dripping pie crumbs claiming that they've never been near a pie in their life, or that the actual pie is over there being eaten by someone else, or, oh, look, a unicorn. It just doesn't happen like that in normal life. Trump does it, Johnson does it. Hard to think of any other politicians who do it that blithely and that crassly and that blatantly. And I think it's the blatantness that allows them to get away with it. But what the committee have done, and the more I dig into it, the clearer this becomes, is that they have used his own behaviour as the proof of what he was thinking. So when he claims, well, I may have said that, but I was thinking this, they say, well, you can't have been thinking that because you did that. That's where it all falls apart. That's why he's gone completely doolally this morning, as Chris Bryant said, like a cross between Kenneth Williams and Donald Trump. It is like a toddler's tantrum, the response that he tried to get into the public space. Successfully, we've got to be honest, it's only us that are behaving with decorum in this matter and acknowledging that you don't let the guilty party give a press conference after they've been sent down from the court. But the attempt to get it into the space is utterly unhinged, which inevitably will draw the support of people like Nadine Dorries and Brendan Clark-Smith. Alistair is in East Lothian. Alistair, what would you like to say?
Good morning, James.
Hello, mate.
It seems almost a shame to interrupt your.
I know what you mean, actually. Thank you for that. And that makes two of us.
This morning.
That makes two of us. Probably only two, but I'll take it where I find it. Thank you very much.
Good. Don't over-entitle narcissists. Just make the best leaders of countries.
Aye, it's true, isn't it? It's true, isn't it? Incredible to think that even now people are sort of polishing him.
Yeah. You can understand why. I'm just reading that final paragraph of the committee, why he resigned immediately. Yeah. You can understand exactly. But it's the aftermath, isn't it? The committee have done a good job, but what they've done is they have basically put a pinhole in the curtain of night. They've looked at a tiny, tiny little aspect of what's happened in the last 2 years, and this is the conclusion they've come to.
They left the door open, didn't he? That which he wasn't expecting to happen. It's a bit like Al Capone's tax returns, in a way.
Yeah.
And you think of all the things he should have gone for. I mean, it's a bit like his final defenestration, which had nothing to do with the various, if you'd like, Premier League scandals, and everything to do with a seamy little story about him promoting somebody that he knew to be a sex pest. Although everyone pretends that they don't understand that either. That's the mad bit about the fanboys and fangirls, is that they're literally saying things out loud that everybody knows aren't true. And yet, I guess that's the model that Johnson has made for them.
I mean, as a supporter of Scottish independence,
well done for bringing that in.
I pretty much rejoiced on the day that he was made leader of the Tory party and Prime Minister, because I did feel that this could only go one way. I'm not interested in the man. I don't care about the man. He's crashed and burned. If he's destroyed good and well, he's been totally unfit for public office since the day he stepped into it. But,
no, you're right. Well, I mean, there's duty demands that I point out. Your last leader may yet end up in hottish, if not hotter water, Alistair. So it would be remiss of me not to remind everybody listening of that fact. It is coming up to 11 o'clock. You are listening to James O'Brien on LBC. We already did the how did it happen? But that's the question that still fascinates you. The problem is we end up dancing around the same answers. There's never going to be an answer, or even a combination of answers that would allow us, if we were writing an essay for our politics A-level 10 years from now, and it just said, how on earth did Boris Johnson happen to the United Kingdom? I don't think anyone would ever get 100%. I know things have changed a bit since I was at school, or indeed university, but I don't think you can get 100% in answer to that sort of question. But my goodness me, I'm still asking it. 3 minutes after 11 is the time. You look at Trump is still in with a chance of being both president and in prison, possibly at the same time, as John Sopel has been explaining to us from Miami this week. So I don't know about you psychologically. I think it's self-protection. I mean, the scale of what's been done to this country is almost immeasurable. The mess is still complete. I know it still upsets some of you, not many actually anymore, but the idea that trusting Nadine Dorries and Jacob Rees-Mogg instead of, Mark Carney or Sir Paul Nurse, the idea that was ever going to end well, putting Nigel Farage's opinions above Barack Obama's, I just can't believe it, frankly, even now. You look at the mess that's been made, you turn your telly on and Farage is back on it again. It was always going to end like this. In some ways, I'm thinking about the national situation, there was a little slither of hope in 2018, 2019, when Theresa May might have got something over the line that mitigated the damage that we were about to do ourselves. Her challenge was, of course, to mitigate the damage that we were doing to ourselves while pretending that we weren't actually doing any damage at all. The failure of Paul Dacre, the editor of the Daily Mail, to understand what Brexit would involve. So many different elements explaining the disaster. Rupert Murdoch doing what Rupert Murdoch always does, i.e. whatever is best for Rupert Murdoch. If he thought staying in the European Union would be better for business, we'd probably still be in the European Union. All of that. But then Johnson became the embodiment of it, as he was perhaps always destined to do. Who else could become the embodiment of the biggest lie that a country has ever fallen for, or this country has ever fallen for? Who else but Boris Johnson could be the embodiment of that? Who else could benefit from a country falling for the mother of all lies? And there it was. Along he came. carried into Parliament on the shoulders of an 80-seat majority, claiming that he'd got Brexit done when everybody honest knew he hadn't, claiming that he cared about sovereignty when everybody honest knew he didn't, claiming that he would be able to deliver unicorns and brooches of purest green when everybody knew he couldn't. And there you see it. Look, I'm not going to lie to you. I thought on several occasions over the last few years that the dam would never break. It would never be breached. There were so many shoulders to the wheel. I'm mixing my metaphors quite beautifully this morning. There were so many shoulders to the Johnson wheel and so few of us pushing back in the opposite direction that there were times when I honestly believed it would never break, that the lies would just get bigger and bigger and bigger. The attempts to defend him against obvious egregiousness were insuperable. You know, I remember the 12 front pages about Keir Starmer having a curry in Durham. Do you remember that? 12 front pages about that. And I just sat there thinking, how do you ever get the truth in front of people when lies like this, the false equivalence, the attempt to pretend that what Johnson had done was in any way comparable to what Starmer had done? Quite incredible. Someone took a photograph of Keir Starmer having a drink through a window at the end of a hard day's work, and people trying to claim that it's comparable to behaviour that ultimately led to a 90-day suspension recommendation from a jury of his own peers, 4 of whom were appointed by him. Like, it's just incredible. So yeah, there were times when I thought that was it. I think we've lost. When the party tells you to ignore the evidence of your own eyes and ears, that is their final, most terrible command. And we're still in it. I'm sorry to put the champagne back in the fridge again, but we're still in it. We are still in the ignore the evidence of your own eyes and ears territory. But I am now thinking that we're beginning to climb out. So many questions that still need to be answered. Questions about Keir Starmer. Questions about Brexit. Questions about the economy that need much more robust answers than they've currently got. So many, but I think we're beginning perhaps to climb out of that pit of deceit and despondency. I don't know. I mean, a lot of the people that dug it are still there shilling away. But that faith in the public, that's the only thing that sustains you through times like this, has to be there. And Johnson, I think, now, well, who still thinks he's not naked? 0345 6060 973. Who still thinks he's not naked? How much of the crowd now is pointing at his quivering, bloated buttocks and claiming that he's still clad in magnificent robes? Rees-Mogg is, Dorries is, Brendan Clark-Smith is. But how many of the public are? I don't know. We may never know, because we may never be offered an opportunity to find out. It seems he has been so completely done in by this report that he's had a fit of the vapours, a toddler's temper tantrum, a throwing of rattles on the sort of scale that demeans both him and the office that he used to hold. And maybe it's game over. But I keep coming back to the horror film. I keep coming back to the horror film, checking the time. Because you can't. When does it end? Is he going to come back from the grave? Is he going to crawl out of the crypt? Is he going to come staggering out of the cellar with a pickaxe poking out the back of his head? I don't know. That's the tragedy. Because today is a good day. If not a day for celebration, then a day for rumination. A day for contemplation. A day to reflect upon the fact that ultimately, in the final analysis, the system worked. The system worked. They tried to break it, and that's not an exaggeration. This is important. They tried to break it. They tried to rip up the Standards Committee. He got rid of ethics advisors. They tried to break the institutions that protect us from people like him. Let's never forget that. Not properly explained, not properly understood. They tried to break all of the institutions, all of the measures, the checks, the balances that protect us. They still are. They call it red tape. Or they call it, nanny state, or they call it the blob. All of the things that are there to protect us from them. Because all of the system understands that you can get to the top, even if you're like Boris Johnson. And today the system worked. Today the system worked. I am inevitably, this being this programme, going to invite you now to tell me why you're not as optimistic as I am. 0345 6060 973. Has the system worked? Has the system worked? I'm crying today. My dad died on a ventilator. We couldn't say goodbye while he was partying. I hate him. It's not an uncommon text, or not an uncommon tone of text that is coming in to the programme. 11 after 11 is the time. Sarah is in Newark-on-Trent. Sarah, what would you like to say?
So my dad was on a ventilator. He had appendicitis and caught COVID in that stage, and he was in QMC in Nottingham. Then he was moved from there to Burton-on-Trent.
Right.
Because they were like, we need to make space for people who've got a better chance of surviving.
Oh,
then he was moved from there to Chesterfield. But I moved in with my mum in that time, and every single day we were getting phone calls from Test and Trace saying someone from this house has tested positive from COVID. And we're like, yeah, he's on a ventilator. We've had no contact. He's on a ventilator. It's probably on record that he's on a ventilator. And then while that was happening, Johnson was breaking all the social distancing records.
And claiming
having parties.
Yeah, you can't find the words, can you? You can't find the words.
It's just horrific. And it's like, did we get to do a leaving party for my dad when he left QMC to go to the next hospital? No, we didn't. No. And eventually, when he was in Chesterfield, they did let us go, and we had to wear quite kind of spacesuit sort of level PPE. Right. And we did get to go in. They were really kind, and we held his hand, and that's when he sort of turned around, and he's all right now. But it was such a
contrast of behaviours, the things you were doing because you were told to do them.
I think he knew it was on the ventilator. He was kind of a bit unconscious and coming in and out, but we were able to hold his hand and be with him. And then he started to get better. And it's like, that was such a struggle to get to that point where they were just drinking and partying. The photos show it all, don't they? I've been watching the news this morning. The photos show that.
Yeah.
They measured that room and how many people were in that room.
Yeah, and the claim that he didn't realise it was a party, and then the claim that it was a necessary party, and then the claim. I mean, goodness me,
leaving do. Did the NHS staff who probably had to go off under extreme stress? Did they get a leaving do? No.
That's the pincer movement reading through that got him in the end, is that he could claim not to understand this or not to know that or not to, or he could claim to believe this, but the evidence of his behaviour undermines his own defence of his own.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, would he endorse it in any other organisation? No. So
listen to this bit. Listen to this bit. We came to the view that some of Mr. Johnson's denials and explanations were so disingenuous that they were, by their very nature, deliberate attempts to mislead the committee and the House, while others demonstrated deliberation because of the frequency with which he closed his mind to the truth. I mean, that's essentially saying he doesn't know the difference between true and false, does he?
No, and I think what you said earlier on about gaslighting, he's the epitome of that.
He is, isn't he?
Absolute epitome, because then you start thinking, can someone be that, bad? But he does manage to convince people, and like you said as well, why is he getting, if someone's convicted of something, they don't get to kind of come out and go, oh no, well, they're all wrong.
Here's his old mate to tell you what a stand-up guy he is, and now he's been more sinned against than sinning. Sarah, I'm glad that your story had a happy ending, at least with regard to your dad, because for a heck of a lot of people listening, he never would have done, of course. They didn't have a happy ending. Thank you. Again, come at it from whatever angle you like, but I think looking for something to be positive about, and it's a character difference. I don't understand. I never will understand that mindset that rejoices in other people's misfortune. It's been a key part of British politics for the last few years. It really explains the situation that we found ourselves in. I mean, obviously, I'm not flipping made of would. I see Nadine Dorries consistently humiliating herself in public at the moment, and the knowledge that she tried to get me fired means that I'll allow myself a little bit of schadenfreude, but it's schadenfreude immediately diluted by the knowledge of the damage that she and people like her have done to my country. But the kind of mindset, you see it on both sides. It's not unique to the left or unique to the right, where you derive more pleasure from the pain of people you don't like than you do from the success of people you do like, or the improvement of the country that you share. Oh, I don't care about the country. I just want Remainers to get a bloody nose. I will never, ever understand that mindset, which is why today the good news is not that Boris Johnson has finally been vanquished, destroyed, unveiled, revealed. It's that the system, which is all we have, the system seems to have worked. It's 11:16. 19 minutes after 11 is the time, and you are listening to James O'Brien on LBC. What are we thinking about Mystery Hour? I don't know. I mean, it probably was 52-48 when I came on air this morning, that we wouldn't do it. I don't know. You tell me. I mean, there aren't days like this. They don't come along very often. This is historic. This is A-level politics for 20, 30, 40 years to come or more. And you know, it'll be up there. Well, actually, there's a question, if you're feeling clever. What will it be up there with? You know? Chamberlain waving his piece of paper when he came back from Berlin? What will it be up there with? This disgrace? This level of disgrace? Profumo, probably. That was a good example of someone lying to the House. Do you know what John Profumo did after he left Parliament in disgrace? He spent, and this is probably slightly mythologised, but it comes from a kernel of truth. He spent the rest of his life atoning, largely by working with homeless people in central London. I think I could have got that wrong. But what other scandal? I mean, what else is up there? But he wasn't a prime minister, of course. For a prime minister to leave office in this way, I think it is completely unprecedented to leave office in this way and then to be followed by this level of conduct. I don't know. What would you put it up with? Is there anything if you were writing a book now? Obviously, I am, but I'm not doing it because of that. God knows how many updates this book's going to need before it's even been published. If you were writing a book now, what would you compare this to? That is a question that you can't answer at the moment. The switchboard's full, but I might ask it again when I've got a couple of phone lines. Because where would you put it? If you were a bit of a political anorak like me, or more than me, perhaps, where would you put this? Where you say, well, this sits with that, or this sits alongside. Where would you put it? Watergate? That's just come in by text. I don't know. Early indications are that we won't be doing Mystery Hour today. That never happens. Normally, the minute I mention the possibility that we'd drop it, the texts and tweets go bonkers in the opposite direction. So we shall see. Glenn's in Lightwater. Glenn, what made you pick up the phone?
Well, morning, James. I picked up the phone because I just find it devastating that the people are still trying to defend the indefensible. My mother was a constituent of Boris Johnson, living in Hillingdon. She was dying with dementia. I had to go and self-isolate with Mum and look after her because we didn't have any carers at the time that could help.
Right.
My 4 sisters and 1 brother couldn't come because I was there. I was the person that was in that bubble with Mum. When Mum died, we couldn't have a funeral service for her. We couldn't all attend the funeral. We couldn't have a reception for friends and family. We couldn't do the things that we did for our father the year before. And then to find out that 1, on an industrial scale, he was doing what he was doing. 2, he didn't have the decency to be honest. 3, he actually would seem believes his own lies.
Yes.
And what's even worse, if you've got people that are supposed to be, have been cabinet ministers, members of the Privy Council, still members of Parliament, who support this man as if he can do no wrong, when it's blatantly obvious he's totally unfit to hold public office.
Can you get your head around that?
And he should never... No, I can't.
Because I thought by now we'd be able to get a better handle on that. I mean, there's 2 things you've touched on there, both utterly and inarguably true. The man wouldn't know the truth if it sat on his head. And people constantly, consistently, completely defend him, despite the fact they can see that he wouldn't know the truth if it sat on his head. They are mysteries, aren't they? Probably timeless mysteries.
It just beggars belief. We wonder why in history did we get people like Stalin, Pol Pot, other dictators, Mao, and we've got some currently, so perhaps we can go into that. But
No, I know.
But he's in the same league.
Well, he's not
I mean,
clearly he's not in the. I mean, I know you don't mean this, but just because we live in a world where people love nothing more than to deliberately misconstrue what you mean is, how can anybody allow someone to rule over them who is so obviously lying through their teeth all the time? And I guess in a way, your parallels are a bit ridiculous, but also evidence of a lucky escape.
Well, the fact that this has finally come out should be the end of his political ambitions.
What's Sunak going to do?
Forever. Should be. Well,
what's Sunak going to do? Sunak was Chancellor throughout all of this. Sunak was defending him up until, I forget the chronology. What does this do to a government? I mean, the cabinet's full of people that were on Johnson's team. What are they going to do?
They're totally weakened, aren't they? The days are probably numbered, but they should or they shouldn't be.
I don't know. I mean, does this accelerate the chance of a general election? Okay, true or false? I'm not going to be able to find it in time. I'm just looking at something's been sent to me that has allegedly come from Nadine Dorries' Twitter account, but I'm genuinely not being disingenuous, Glenn. I don't believe it to be true. I think it must be a parody, so I'm not going to read it out on the programme until I've checked. I'm sorry for your loss. I really am. And it's interesting. I haven't asked about that, but a lot of the calls are coming in unprompted, making comparisons like the one Glenn makes about what their families were going through when Johnson was doing what he was doing, and then lying about it, and then lying about it, and then seeking to impugn and abuse the people that were determined to get to the truth about him lying about it and lying about it. That's the incredible bit, perhaps, as Glenn says. Take care, mate. I'm going to check the provenance of this tweet, because even by her non-existent standards, this is off the charts. Jason's in Kingston upon Thames. Jason, what would you like to say?
Morning, James. I'm speaking from the perspective from somebody who's been a Conservative Party member for all of his kind of adult life, an activist, and up until last year I was a Conservative councillor in South West London.
Okay.
And I was never a Boris Johnson supporter. I'd met him a few times. I'd tracked his career like most of us, either willingly or unwillingly had to over the years. And he always gave to me the countenance of somebody who is very skin deep, considers the Conservative Party to be his own private property and by extension government. But with this privileged committee explosion, because nobody expected them to be quite as harsh as this, including myself.
No, certainly not him.
It just goes to show, James, that there was that simmering resentment of him for many years. But there's three factors at play.
I don't know that I agree with that. A simmering resentment of the things you've just described, as in his contempt for standards, his entitlement, his belief that the Conservative Party and subsequently government was somehow his right, his birthright, and his fiefdom. It's not. This isn't driven by personal animus. This is driven by disapproval of conduct.
I think that the two overlap, actually, because Johnson's style and his career trajectory has always been marbled into his personality. If you don't like his politics, that correlates with a dislike of his personality, his character, and his style. I don't know what
his politics are.
His politics are, quite simply, in my opinion, populist, centre-right, opportunistic, Eurosceptic.
He's not a Eurosceptic.
Well, he is when it suits.
He's not a populist. He was going to have an amnesty for illegal immigrants when he was campaigning to be mayor of London, and for the record, I think he meant it. You know, he wrote a column in favour of staying in the European Union, and even in the years prior to that, he was talking about how ridiculous it would be to leave. I mean, in many ways, I'm endorsing your position, because if he hasn't got any politics, then the impossibility of blurring or distinguishing his actions from his personality becomes more acute. But I don't think he believes in anything, Jason.
He certainly believes in himself,
yes,
there's no doubt about that. And the Conservative Party is obviously the most comfortable bespoke suit for his ambitions in life.
Yes.
But the personality that he has obviously, came to the fore when he just showed quite obvious contempt for the Privileges Committee. And if I was in his position, I would probably feel the same, because in my opinion, it's quite clear that there was a certain bias trajectory from the chair, and be that as it may,
No, you see, you can't let that pass either. What did Harriet Harman say prior to the committee report that has turned out not to be true?
I think anybody who is, a keen study of politics is involved in politics.
I am. So I'd ask you to answer the question. What has she said in the past that turned out not to be true?
Well, I couldn't give you verbatim quotes.
Well, hang on, you're the keen student of politics. You've just impugned her live on the radio, mate.
No. I said, be that as it may, she is perceived.
I don't care about be that as it may. You said she was.
In my observation.
So give me the evidence for the observation. You know how this show works.
Well, I guess you would have to look at any particularly strong...
No, I'm asking for your evidence.
I didn't...
For what you said.
I haven't come with a barrister's bundle of evidence.
Don't need a barrister's bundle, Jason. I need one example of what you've just accused her of.
Well, you've put me on the spot there, so...
No, I haven't. I've simply repeated your own words back to you and asked you to justify them.
No, I'm not sparring with you here, so...
Well, you were for a bit.
Oh, no, I wasn't, James. I wouldn't spar with you.
No.
You're one of my favourite presenters.
So just to clarify, no evidence whatsoever for your attempt to impugn Harriet Harman's reputation a moment ago?
It would... Well, it's
just to clarify.
That she's no fan.
Just to clarify. Well, nor are you.
Well, yes, but I agree with some of his politics. The fact is, it was obviously a very stern committee against him. I happen to agree.
With 4 Tories on it that he appointed, and a majority of Conservatives. And a former chair that recused himself because he perhaps did fit the characterisation that you've just, with no evidence whatsoever, applied to Harriet Harman.
Okay, all right. Well, if Harriet's listening, sorry, Harriet. But I guess what I'm saying is I agree with the Privileges Committee. I didn't expect it to be quite so harsh. I think he was always onto a loser anyway because the evidence that was stacked against him was strong.
Oh, there we are. Because the evidence, not because of the composition of the committee or the history of the chair, because of the evidence, Jason.
Well, it's a simple fact, James, that human beings will be keener recipients for evidence than others. That's just the nature of human beings. And
except it's not, is it? Not in the context of either judges, juries, or indeed select committees, which are examining behaviour. They are required to be impartial. And I mean, although you're phrasing it very politely, if you had been in Boris Johnson's shoes, you too would be accused of trying to impugn the committee and thereby undermine the democratic process of the House.
Well, the thing is, if I was in his position...
You literally just tried to do it.
Well, if I was in his position, unfortunately I'm not, I certainly wouldn't have gone about it in the same way. I would have done it in a delicate way, in a way that's befitting of parliamentary language.
You mean like you just did?
Well, I suppose to an extent, yes.
Yeah, and how do you think that went?
Well, considering you picked me up on it, not quite so well. But...
Have a great day. I'm late for the news. I've got to go. It's 11:30. Thomas Watts is here with your headlines. 26 minutes to 12. 2 things. That Nadine Dorries tweet is true, and I think it might be the craziest thing I've seen all day. And bearing in mind, I've not only read Boris Johnson's response to the Privileges Committee report, I've picked through a lot of the Privileges Committee report as well. Absolutely off the charts now. Poor old Ms. Dorries. And Tony's text here just made me laugh out loud during the break. He says, James, when you do stuff like that, I laugh my head off in my van and shout wedgie. Takes me back, Tony. Thank you. Talking about taking me back, I remember interviewing Rory Stewart, the former International Development Secretary and Conservative MP, not long ago, on full disclosure. Well, it was long ago in one sense, but not long ago in terms of mere chronology. And I asked him if he thought Boris Johnson was dangerous. That was the question I asked him. And there was a very, very long pause, a much longer pause than is customary in political interviews, and probably a much longer pause than either of us would have countenanced on the radio. But podcasts are much bigger landscapes, as Rory has, of course, subsequently discovered in his own very successful project with Alistair Campbell. And then at the end, I wonder if you can remember what you said, Rory?
I can't, James.
Nor can I. It was pretty close to yes. I don't believe it. We've booked 2 guests today, and they've both gone south. Hang on, I think we lost the line there. It was a cautious affirmative, Rory Stewart, when I asked whether or not he was dangerous.
I think he's definitely proved that he's dangerous now.
Yes.
I think there's absolutely no doubt about that, and I think he's dangerous because he is challenging the Constitution again and again. He's challenging all the things that Parliament, the courts, everything that's supposed to protect us against politicians.
This is a point which is I mean, you won't be surprised to learn, I think absolutely crucial and possibly getting overlooked, because we can go back to the prorogation, we can go back to the Owen Paterson story, we can go back to the resignation of ethics advisors, the refusal to reappoint. There was, and because he's so chaotic, it's hard to say with confidence that it was concerted, but there were certainly repeated and consistent attempts to trash the institutions that essentially hold everything together.
And it's very weird because he campaigned for Brexit on saying the reason he was doing it was for parliamentary sovereignty. We were going to leave the European Union. We were going to restore British institutions, Parliament, the court. But actually what he's done is every time they've criticised him or in any way stood in his way, he's gone on to rubbish them. And it makes it feel as though the only thing that matters obviously to him is himself. I mean, and he doesn't care how much he trashes, how much he lies, how many institutions he craps on, as long as he, Boris, manages to continue with his weird cult.
Well, I might ask you about the actual cult in a moment, but before that, you've sat on select committees and you would have been following these events very closely. Most people so far surprised, perhaps initially, by how far they went in terms of the sanction or the suggested sanction, and then upon consideration and upon study of the report, probably not that surprised after all. But it is, I mean, it's a biggie, isn't it? 90 days and a withdrawal of a parliamentary pass being suggested. Have they gone a little further than perhaps you expected?
I think they've definitely gone further. I think they have been made even angrier by the way that he's attacked the committee and the way that he tried to resign before they suspended him. He was jumping before he was pushed, and that sort of added to their sense of fury. But it's also important to remember, as people have pointed out, that the majority of this committee are Conservative Party members.
Yes, of course.
Including, and quite a broad variety from different ages, different intakes, different parts of the Conservative Party, ranging from Brexiteers through to people who are more on the Remain side. And the fact that they're all unanimous in it just demonstrates their sense as parliamentarians of disgust at the way Boris Johnson lied to them.
Which brings us to the cult. I'm not this morning, plenty of other people will, for good or for ill, giving much weight or attention to his tantrum, to his response that was probably itself a contempt of Parliament, given that it was made available to people before the report was. But when you look at former colleagues still clinging on, do you have an understanding of them that perhaps that would elude the rest of us? These are people that you broke bread with, that you went through the lobby with, that you followed whips with. You see some of these people now still clinging to the carcass of Johnson's career. Do you get it in any way?
It's very, very strange. Very strange. And some of these people, I remember back in 2019 when I was trying to run for the leadership against Boris.
Of course.
Were not as fanatical about him then. I mean, back in the day, I remember one of them who's been caught up in a lot of this saying to me, when I said, how can you possibly support Boris? He's a terrible human being. He's going to be a terrible prime minister. He said to me, yeah, that may or may not be true, Rory, but he's a winner. He's going to win. And what seems to have happened is they've gone from seeing him as a kind of useful tool for winning elections into seeing him as the kind of representative of everything they care about in the world.
Yeah.
And I guess that is that they've been dragged deeper and deeper. I think having tied themselves to him and defended him in the first 10 or 15 scandals, they almost feel they have no choice other than to continue defending him. A lot of these people, of course, have been rewarded by him. I mean, you need to look at the fact that almost all the people out defending him have got knighthoods from him, or he was trying to put them in the House of Lords. So I think that's another thing to bear in mind here.
Where does that leave the party?
Leaves the party in a terrible situation. I mean, Boris Johnson, in addition to trashing Parliament, insulting the courts, is basically trying to take the Conservative Party down with him.
Do you think so?
Yeah. His fantasy is to take his revenge on Rishi Sunak, prove that he's bigger than anybody. He's almost certainly going to try to provide. If he can't take over the Conservative Party again after the next election, he'll try to create some splinter faction group to get himself back in. And he doesn't care how much damage he's doing, doesn't care that he's insulting the current Prime Minister, undermining Conservatives' electoral chances, because in the end, it's all about Boris Johnson.
What would you advise Rishi Sunak to do?
I think he's got to lean into who he is. So, I mean, his reputation is for being slightly more steady, understated, professional. He's got to hope that he can let Boris embarrass himself and not get dragged too deeply into this.
And with regard to this, it's hard to imagine what he could say that wouldn't upset or even alienate parts of his own party now.
Yes, although it may be that we're exaggerating how many members of parliament this is.
Yes,
I mean,
of course.
Some of them are resigning in Boris's favour anyway, so they won't be around very long.
Well, you say that. Some of them have already changed their mind, or at least pressed the delay button until some unspecified point in the future.
No, and I think the other thing that's going to be tough for him is the vote, because this committee just presents a vote to Parliament, and that vote will really split the Conservative Party between people like Jacob Rees-Mogg, who keeps saying, this is all storm in a teacup, it was just a piece of cake.
Sir Jacob, Rory, just to prove your previous point.
Absolutely. And I think he's a very interesting example in this, because he was a guy who, when I joined Parliament with him, was one of the most pompous defenders of the idea of Parliament, kind of big professional backbencher, read all the detailed parliamentary procedures, loved all that stuff. And he's now saying, I think in his latest tweet, Parliament's taking itself too seriously.
Gosh, the irony. I think I'd just thank you there, because we could talk all day, but I appreciate you've got other things that you need to be. Oh, I'll tell you what, one final question, because you are a historian as well, of course, as a politician. Can you put it alongside anything else from British political history? Have you sort of, we can call it a scandal. I think that's probably a matter of record. What does it sit beside? What is it up there with?
I think Boris Johnson, I think, is in my mind close to being the worst Prime Minister I can think of. I mean, going back in history, there were some terrible ones in the 18th century.
Lord North
wasn't up to much, yeah. But I think Boris is in a sense worse, because all the others, even if they were pretty ineffectual, strangely in Britain retained a very strong degree of respect for the institutions.
Or fear. If not respect, then at least fear of the institutions.
Yeah, but I think, I was just talking to John Major yesterday. He's an example of somebody who, he was a Conservative. There'll be many listeners who won't like him, but he had a very, very strong sense of what was decent.
Yes.
And I think that sort of stayed with him. And I think that probably would have been true of Clement Attlee on the Labour side. So going back in the day, the only person I think that maybe measures us up, who was an incomparably better politician, more effective Prime Minister, but had some of the same shakiness and shadiness to him, was Lloyd George, who was clearly pretty corrupt, pretty peculiar back in the 1920s. But apart from that, I'm struggling to find anyone quite as immoral as Boris Johnson occupying that position.
Rory Stewart, many thanks indeed. I quite like that question about the historical parallels, although, and Lloyd George, of course, also infamous for dishing out gongs like they were going out of fashion, which brings us to, but just bear Rory's words in mind there about the way in which all of the cronies and the most sycophantic of sycophants have been rewarded with various gongs and awards. And I'm going to read you something that Nadine Dorries, who is still an MP, despite promising a week ago to resign with immediate effect, bless her. I'm going to read you something that Nadine Dorries has said in the last, or tweeted at least, in the last hour. And I'm going to tell you now that this, for me, and I always hesitate to say these sort of things out loud, I don't see how it can go any more bonkers than this. All right? This is Nadine Dorries, still in the middle of a hissy fit about not getting into the House of Lords. A week since she promised to resign with immediate effect, she revealed yesterday that she's not actually resigning yet at all. Nobody, including surely Nadine Dorries' closest loved ones, believe that she's getting a seat in the House of Lords as a reward for her political acumen or achievements. I mean, literally nobody can believe for a moment that Nadine Dorries is getting a seat in the House of Lords because of her her proven track record of grasping and successfully scrutinising legislation. Nadine Dorries. An hour ago. Are you ready for this? You might want to sit down. We also need to keep a close eye on the careers of the Conservative MPs who sat on that committee. Do they suddenly find themselves on chicken runs into safe seats? Gongs? Were promises made? We need to know if they were. Justice has to be seen to be done at all levels of this process. So that's Nadine Dorries, who thought Boris Johnson was going to put her into the House of Lords for undisclosed services rendered, suggesting that the House of Commons Privileges Committee, the 4 Conservative MPs put on it by Boris Johnson, have been bribed by Rishi Sunak with unspecified future rewards in return for arriving at the conclusions that they have painstakingly explained in 30,000 words of report. And what is so incredible about that tweet, even by the standards of Nadine Dorries, who probably has entertained us long enough, actually. What is so incredible about that tweet, I think, is she's essentially accusing Rishi Sunak of what we know Boris Johnson has done. And she lacks either the intelligence or the probity to see that. And who here thinks Jacob Rees-Mogg, out of all of the politicians to serve in Boris Johnson's cabinets, that Jacob Rees-Mogg would be the most effective, the most honest, the finest upholder of tradition? Jacob Rees-Mogg, who lied to the late Queen. Jacob Rees-Mogg, who tried to rip up the rule book after Owen Paterson broke it. Jacob Rees-Mogg, who has impugned parliamentary democracy itself on countless occasions, as Rory Stewart just reminded us. He gets a knighthood. A 29-year-old woman who no one is quite sure what she's ever done gets a seat in the House of Lords. Nadine Dorries thought she was going to get a seat in the House of Lords. Boris Johnson almost certainly told her she was getting a seat in the House of Lords. And she is suggesting that Rishi Sunak might bribe Tory MPs with gongs and honours and rewards in return for doing what he wants. I think that sound you can hear. Hush a minute. Yeah, that sound you can hear was irony dying. 11:52 is the time. Some sad news this morning. The actress and former MP Glenda Jackson has died at the age of 87. It's just been announced by her agent, who say Glenda Jackson, 2-time Academy Award-winning actress and politician, died peacefully at her home in Blackheath, London, this morning after a brief illness with her family at her side. She'd recently completed filming The Great Escaper, in which she co-starred with Michael Caine. Magnificent woman. I mean, what a life. What a life. A superlative actress. I had the privilege of seeing her King Lear not long ago at the Old Vic, I think. And it was one of those moments in theatre where you are transported to a place you did not know existed. And a privilege doesn't come close. Also, one of the first politicians I ever got to interview after changing lanes long ago in my career, from sort of faffing about in the shallow end to getting on the road that would lead me eventually here. And she was so gracious and so charming. That is a life well lived. My condolences, my heartfelt condolences to her family, especially her son Dan, who I have crossed swords with quite a lot in recent years, but who at a moment like this deserves nothing but support and sympathy. What a magnificent life and a magnificent woman. And I've not touched on the politics, upon the role that she played. Imagine that. Imagine being such a high achiever in 2 separate fields. Quite incredible. And in fact, I won't resist the urge to draw a contrast with the politician and journalist that we have been discussing for most of the day. What a gulf of difference there is between the public service and the public delight brought to us by Glenda Jackson compared to the man that we've been talking about all morning. 11:54 is the time. I don't know if you remember an MP, I think, if memory serves, possibly an MP for Brent Central, who got slung out of the House of Commons in 2021, July 2021, if memory serves, for saying that Boris Johnson had lied repeatedly to the House of Commons. It was, of course, Dawn Butler, who joins me now. I bet you're feeling pretty silly this morning.
Good morning, James. Well, it's a very important report that Parliament has published, because a lot of people are saying to me, do I want an apology? And actually, it's not really about me. And when I stood up and called Boris Johnson a liar, it really wasn't about me. It was about exposing the fact that we had a Prime Minister who was constantly and consistently lying to Parliament, and I couldn't do anything about it. I tabled an EDM 383. I went to the whip. I tried everything I possibly could within the system to try and get him to correct his behaviour, and he wouldn't do it. And that's why, I had to call him a liar. And
knowing full well,
yours was the only radio station that I did on the day, because the phone was red hot.
Yes,
but I could feel that, it's like I was being hounded. How dare you break the parliamentary rules and standards? I was being hounded, but yet still this liar was just walking free.
Desperate times called for desperate measures, I suppose, is the best way of describing it.
Yeah, well, yes, absolutely. And I was desperate. I thought to myself, I cannot know better and not do better. So I could not be part of an establishment where I know somebody's lying to Parliament, but also to the country. And also, I think it was a really important lesson for our democracy, because it showed that our democracy is not robust enough or strong enough to handle somebody like Boris Johnson, somebody who's really just so engulfed in their privilege that they feel they can just do whatever they like. Our democracy just isn't strong enough to handle that.
So you don't feel that today's events are proof that the system is strong enough, because it was a coincidence and circumstance that brought about the sequence of events that have led us to here. It wasn't necessarily the system kicking in.
We shouldn't have had to go through all of this.
There should have been a system of alarm and redress activated earlier, but that does not exist. Well, I mean, it's a bit like the Founding Fathers, not imagining Donald Trump ever coming along, so the Constitution not being fit for purpose when it comes to coping with someone prepared to ride so roughshod over so much. I mean, do we lose faith in the system, or do we just cross our fingers that we never get another Boris Johnson?
No, we have to strengthen the system.
Right.
It's paramount. This is a lesson that we all need to learn, and we have to strengthen the system. This has shown us, because, the likelihood is that we may well get another Boris Johnson in the future. And, the fact is this, our current government has forgotten what they're there for. A government is supposed to, one, protect its citizens. Our government has failed on that time and time again. It's supposed to be, it's supposed to have sound fiscal
yes.
over the country, and it's not. It's we've lost billions of pounds due to fraud, and we're not pursuing that. So this government has forgotten what it's there for. It's so carried away with taking money out of the public purse and giving it to their mates and just doing whatever they can. If that means lying, then they'll do the lying. And so this is a lesson that we all have to learn. There's no fiscal responsibility within this government. There's no protection of its citizens within this government. It's really problematic. I mean, this is our democracy. You're now not allowed to protest. They squeezed this through yesterday. I mean, it's like, how is this possible? How are we allowing this to happen? I feel that there should be protests on the streets every day.
Well, I can't let you go without pointing out that really the job of stopping it is yours.
I'm trying.
Well, all right. Well, I didn't mean just Dawn Butler. I meant the whole opposition. I mean, your words could be construed as suggesting that the opposition isn't doing a good enough job of stopping stuff from happening at the moment.
Well, if I'm honest with you, James, and you know that I like to be honest, and you know that
it'll never catch on.
I've written a book, as you know, like A Purposeful Life, and it's given me the opportunity to sort of journey through lots of things that I've done in Parliament and outside of Parliament. And if I'm honest with you, I think we could be doing a better job as opposition in holding the government to account or even exposing everything this government's doing. They're doing so much, it's really hard to keep track of all the infringements that are happening on our civil rights. It's really difficult to do that. And I think we should be doing a better job, if I'm honest.
I look forward to talking to you about that and the book and the rest of it in much greater detail on Full Disclosure soon, Dawn Butler. Thank you for that. There you go. The Labour MP, essentially comfortable, offering up some mild criticism of our own party, our own leadership, as we survey Conservative MPs seeking to defend the indefensible in the context of Boris Johnson. There's a fascinating little nugget now to share with you about how there might have been a way out for him up until late last week, and then in characteristically chaotic fashion, he blew it up himself. I'll explain that to you after this. 4 minutes after 12, and oddly, by quite popular demand, no mystery hour today. Events considered to be suitably apocalyptic to stick that one in the fridge until next week. If you need your fix, you can, of course, get hold of a Mystery Hour board game at mysteryhour.co.uk or indeed in branches of John Lewis and shortly W.H. Smith, I think. There's also the podcast. There's the archive. Countless historic episodes of Mystery Hour available from Global Player. Ben Kentish, LBC's Westminster editor, is back with me for an update and possibly new nuggets that you've unearthed, Ben.
Well, James, I think we got more of a sense now of what is coming in the next few days. Yes. The government in the last half an hour or so confirming, Penny Mordaunt, the Leader of the House, that there will be a vote on Monday on this report and whether or not to approve it. I understand that will be a free vote, so MPs will have the option of whether to turn up at all and have the option of whether they vote for it.
Who makes that decision?
That's made by the government whips.
So Sunak, essentially.
So Rishi Sunak and Simon Hart, the chief...
do not whip our members.
Exactly, and that gives most of them, I suspect, the option of not turning up at all. Right. Some, I suspect, will turn up perhaps to vote for the report. A small handful have already said that they will turn up to vote against the report. Boris Johnson's supporters still in Parliament.
I mean, it doesn't matter ultimately, does it? Because he's already resigned. But it is optics, theatre, and possibly lists for the future.
Yes, and also it sounds very petty, and in a way it is, James, but the issue of his pass. Former MPs automatically get given a pass to Parliament. It's one of the sort of saving graces of losing your seat. The committee, as we discussed, have said quite clearly that they think that the contempt in which Boris Johnson has treated Parliament is so severe that he should be disqualified from that entitlement. We recommend he should not be entitled to a former member's pass, they say. That's gone down particularly badly with some of his supporters. So it's going to be interesting to see whether that element of it is approved. There will be amendments tabled to this motion. I suspect we will see amendments tabled by the opposition parties, particularly the SNP, calling for Boris Johnson to never be allowed back in Parliament again and so on. They'll try to toughen it up in any way they can. Others will try to reduce and lessen the punishments, and particularly on that issue of the pass. It's likely to pass because the opposition parties will vote for it, even if a small number of Conservative MPs don't. It is almost certain that the report will be approved, including that element of Boris Johnson not getting his former member's pass, which is just humiliating, frankly, for a former Prime Minister.
Well, yeah, and for a former Speaker, of course, because the last person this happened to, I think, was John Bercow, after he was found by an internal inquiry to be a bully. It'll be interesting to see how many of the people who were perfectly comfortable with John Bercow being held to account for the consequences of his actions are similarly supportive of Boris Johnson being held to account for the consequences of his own actions. It occurs to me that last bit probably wouldn't have happened if it wasn't for what he did last week. The words here that I've stumbled across are remarkable because the document he was sent literally states, when he was given an early look at the report, it is a contempt of the House to reveal the contents of this document. There are no other physical copies of the document in existence, and the document is only made available for inspection under invigilated conditions. It must not be copied. The Committee of Privileges will consider final submissions about the content of the document before it publishes its final report in the House. And then they go on, within 24 hours of receiving our warning letter on Friday the 9th of June 2023, Mr Johnson announced his intention to resign as an MP with immediate effect, broke the confidentiality of the process by revealing the contents of the warning letter and linked material, and attacked the committee. So I mean, anyone who's defending him still on the grounds of it was only a cake or it's a witch hunt, I mean, that is arguably the most objectively damning element of the whole report, because he's lying about everything.
Well, all the language is that 90-day penalty was toughened up significantly, not as a result of what they're actually looking into, James, but how Boris Johnson responded to it. The further serious contempt, as the committee puts it, of him impugning, their word, the committee, undermining the democratic process of the House, their quote, and also, they say, being complicit in the campaign of abuse and attempted intimidation. The committee, you're right to also say that this is an inquiry that's been going on. It's just over a year, 13 months now since it was referred to the committee, and their findings weren't made public by the committee themselves, as is always the case and is supposed to be the case, but they were preempted by a statement that Boris Johnson put out last Friday, in which he effectively alluded to and in fact stated what the findings of the committee were. So a further contempt of Parliament there. Two other nuggets for you, James. We touched on it earlier, but in the evidence bundle accompanying this report, quite a damning testimony from a number 10 official. It doesn't say former number 10 official, it just says number 10 official, about exactly what went on in Downing Street. They say this: during the pandemic, number 10, despite setting the rules to the country, was slow to enforce any rules in the building. The press office wine time Fridays continued throughout, social distancing was not enforced, and mask wearing was not enforced. I once inquired whether they should be wearing masks and were told that the science advised that there was no point. This was all part of a wider culture of not adhering to any rules. Number 10 was like an island oasis of normality. And get this, operational notes were sent out from the security team to be mindful of the cameras outside the door, not to go out in groups and to social distance. It was all a pantomime. That's a number 10 official saying no rules were followed, but advice was given about not being seen,
not getting caught,
to not follow the rules.
Don't misbehave. It's not. They're being told not to misbehave. They're being told not to get caught.
Yes, from the security team in Downing Street. Quite something. Just one final bit for you, James. Number 10 in the last few minutes have been talking about this. They insist Rishi Sunak hasn't seen the report.
Oh, come
they wouldn't
on.
say.
For God's sake, he's the only man in Westminster who hasn't.
He's been on an immigration raid. A well-timed
immigration
raid.
He's been on an immigration
a well-timed immigration raid, you might say, if you were being cynical like I am. But they have said this, which is quite interesting. Rishi Sunak's spokesman saying it is wrong to traduce or criticise the work of the Privileges Committee, adding its members have fulfilled their mandate from the House. It's important that the committee carried out the work it was asked to do by Parliament. They wouldn't go further, but a clear rebuttal from Downing Street, siding with the members of the Privileges Committee and rebutting, albeit in this sort of cautious, caveated language, the slurs, the allegations, the conspiracies that have been thrown at members of that committee today and in the days previously by Boris Johnson and his camp.
Two things occur to me. The first is that Harriet Harman's appointment as chairman on June the 29th last year would have been voted for?
Yes, had to be approved by the Commons.
So all of Boris Johnson's supporters voted for it?
I don't know if any.
Well, not all, but I mean,
but all of the whole.
I'm just
process,
looking for things that are being missed from, shall we say, some of the other coverage.
The whole process has to be endorsed and approved by the whole House of Commons.
That's something people might like to be reminded of. And then a known unknown. Do you think people who've used phrases like kangaroo court and witch hunt, they're probably going to be called in by the committee, aren't they? They're going to, because they've also traduced the committee and undermined parliamentary democracy. Even if they're still polishing their new knighthood, they could have some uncomfortable questions to answer as well.
Well, the committee said it's going to publish some sort of separate report, James, into the handling and into the response to its report. They also, though, just on that note, curiously publish a letter from Boris Johnson after his initial testimony, in which he responds to a question that he was asked about some of these claims about kangaroo court. This is a letter from March this year, in which Boris Johnson, writing to committee members, says, at the end of the session, I was asked about a series of questions regarding comments that have been made about the committee's work being a witch hunt or a kangaroo court. Having reviewed the transcript, I am concerned that, at the end of what had been a long hearing, I was not emphatic enough in the answers that I provided. I hope I made clear in those answers I have the utmost respect for the integrity of the committee and all its members and the work it is now doing. This is just over 2.5, it's just over 2 months ago that Boris Johnson sent that letter to the committee, rebutting suggestions suggestions that it's a kangaroo court or a witch hunt. The exact phrases, of course, that he is now using. And the committee...
In print, so he can't even...
In print. And the
pretend he
committee
never said
say
it,
that
yeah.
they believe that amounts to evidence that far from rebutting or distancing himself from that, he was actually very much spurring on those, making those arguments all along.
I mean, it's not often I feel overwhelmed by political events, Ben Kentish, and I'm sure the same is true of you. We've got Monday's debate, which will be interesting, possibly not quite as interesting as people might expect, given how interesting today is currently being. Sunak going on a convenient immigration raid this morning. Rory Stewart telling us, I don't know if you heard earlier, that he fully expects Johnson to hang around, whether it even involves setting up some sort of splinter party. If he's motivated now by malice plus boundless ambition, then he's not going to be giving Sunak an easy ride anytime soon, except that he might wait until after the next general election to make his move. What are Sunak's options here? Does he just stick to this? We haven't seen it. We'll stand by. The committee mustn't be criticised. I mean, does he say anything about his predecessor but one being pilloried, being hauled over the coals in such a public and unprecedented fashion?
He'll have to comment more.
He will at some point. I mean, if not anywhere else, at PMQs he'll be hit with it over the head, won't he?
Yeah, well, he's an MP as well, James. Will he vote on Monday? That's the big question. He is an MP.
There's the question.
He is a party leader.
I bet he gets a foreign trip suddenly, Sunday night. We couldn't announce. I don't want to sound too cynical, but he might go to Ukraine.
He might well do. He might go somewhere. There might be a visit. We don't know. Will he vote? That's the big question his spokesperson was unable to answer. He'll have to say more about it. I think the tone that you've seen already from Rishi Sunak is going to be one of sort of standing by the committee process, but will he stand by its findings? That's the next big question. For the sake of party unity, just politically on this, it's very difficult for him. They will be trying to tread a very fine line between not being seen to have sort of undermined the committee of its findings or side with Boris Johnson. They don't want to side with Boris Johnson, given what's gone on in recent days, but also being aware that there is still admittedly dwindling, but still a number of MPs on the Tory backbenches who are ultra loyal to the former Prime Minister, who Rishi Sunak can't afford to completely isolate, and that they will need to sort of tread that balance between trying to hold a party that is fragmenting by the hour together, but also not be seen to be sort of being influenced or impacted by the allegations that Johnson and his team are making.
Thank God the country's in such a healthy and peaceful place, and that they can afford to devote so much time to these infights and shenanigans. Ben Kentish, many thanks indeed. Time now 12:16. It is 18 minutes after 12, and you are listening to James O'Brien on LBC, where we just veer away from, quite rightly as well, I've offered up my own thoughts already upon the passing of Glenda Jackson, a phenomenal figure, straddling politics and drama in a way that few managed to achieve similarly in either field, never mind both. But Robert Lindsay, the BAFTA and Olivier award-winning actor himself, worked with Glenda Jackson in 2015, and has kindly joins us briefly now, dragging himself away, no doubt, from the political news, Robert. But I'm just keen to hear from someone qualified to tell us just how good she was.
Hi, James. Well, I'm in shock anyway. Your colleagues just told me the terrible news. It's really. I'm just getting used to losing people at the moment. I think we've all reached that terrible age, and when your colleagues and so on go. Glenda, I work with. I mean, the two of us were heavy smokers. I still am, unfortunately. But when we were doing the Zola together in Manchester, we were often outside having a cup of coffee and a fag together. And I realised, when you've admired someone for so long, I mean, when I say admired, I revered her for her stance politically and also her amazing performance, and she has that wonderful ability of being funny and powerful. I mean, she did the Morecambe and Wise show.
I just thought of that when you said funny. I just thought of that in that moment when you said that.
I mean, one of the greatest comedy sketches ever, with the two brilliant, and also to do Touch of Class with Seagull, which I remember, she won an Oscar for that as well. So you're sitting there with your heroine, someone you've admired for so long, and then you suddenly having a fag with her, and you find out that you've got a lot in common. You know, both of our dads were builders. Her dad was a builder. My dad was a carpenter. We're in the building trade. We both left school when we were 16. She worked in Boots, and I worked in the local co-op stacking shelves, and we both went to RADA. So I'm working with this person who I've admired all my life, suddenly with so much in common.
Yeah, it's lovely.
And then obviously politics as well, and her dad.
What did you think? What did you think when she announced she was going into politics? Just you personally, Robert, because it's an odd path for someone on top of their game. So I don't want to impugn anybody, but sometimes people whose careers haven't gone quite as well as they hoped end up in politics. Not mentioning any names, Esther McVeigh, but in the case of Glenda Jackson, she was top of the Premier League when she decided to change course completely.
Yeah, I've often. I mean, you know, now because of social media and stuff, I get a lot of actors, and indeed myself, you know, who say our thoughts on social media. And I think actors tend to be very philosophical about that because we are philosophical about in our work, and we tend to sort of relate our work to what we feel. It's always very difficult sometimes, but and I mean, she was very passionate about, and I mean the Thatcher thing. I mean, we really. I mean, the irony is, I'm about to start filming Sherwood, which is a James Graham series about the miners' strike in Nottingham at the time, which she was, you know, so eloquent and powerful about Thatcher and how she destroyed the social impact that she made on the country at the time. And can you imagine all this was during a fag break?
I can just about. I was going to remind you why you should give up, but if it opens you up to opportunities like that, I think it might fall on deaf ears. Just on the acting side of things, what's the difference between working with someone who's good and working with someone who's beyond good? What's the difference in the moment, on the stage or in the studio or on the set?
I think it's when you work with her. I mean, obviously it was a radio. I would have loved to have performed with her on stage. I think it's that quality that someone who is exceptionally good just makes you better. Just makes you reach the height. You know, if someone's going that far, you got to go with them. You know, and that's. And likewise, when someone's not very good,
of course,
you know,
drag everybody else down as well.
You know, the business is full of posers, and the business is also full of amazingly talented, brilliant people. And Glenda was certainly one of them. You know,
she really was. I'm sorry that it fell to us to break the news to you, Robert. But
yeah, I must admit, I normally pick up my phone earlier, but I'm quite busy at the moment. But suddenly, I was just in shock, and I'm really going to miss her because she was a leader in so many fields. I've gone a bit teary now.
Of course,
just as well a bit. Yeah,
of course.
Oh well. I will, and you too.
Look after yourself, Robert Lindsay, doing the memory of the late Glenda Jackson. Proud there, and quite appropriate, I think, to have a few tears on the passing of a thespian legend like her. 24 minutes after 12 is the time. You're listening to James O'Brien on LBC. I want to pick through. Actually, we must talk to Harry first. The poor lad's been on hold for about 2.5 hours. Harry's in Coventry. Harry, what made you pick up the phone today?
Morning, James.
Hello.
No, I was listening to how eloquently you put, you know, sort of the disdain that Boris Johnson has for this country and for its procedures. And I was sat there, and you know, it's funny. I heard you say, you know, if you were doing A-level politics, I was actually sat there revising for my A-level politics exam.
Lovely. Sorry to disturb you.
It's absolutely fine. And then I thought, well, I must call up because one, my blood is boiling, and two, I can answer that. And actually, one of the questions we planned for one of our earlier exams was how far has Boris Johnson distanced himself from traditional conservatism?
Oh, wow.
Afraid that would not come up on the exam because there's no answer because he believes in nothing but himself. he's not a traditional conservative. He's not a new right. He's nothing. He believes in nothing but himself and how far he wants to make gains.
Yes, of course.
And, and his own.
And it's all there. I mean, there's a history of columns and commentary that proves what you've just said. You can point to evidence that he doesn't believe this because 10 minutes ago he claimed to believe that.
Yeah. Absolutely. And, I was listening to all of the people calling in with, obviously, their testimonies of stuff that's happened in COVID. And me and my family, we lost our great nan in 2021. So we were slightly luckier. It was sort of coming out a little bit.
Sure.
But, I remember when she had a short service, and I remember going into the chapel, and the rows were in sets of 3, and only 3 people could sit on a row. So my younger sister sat with my parents, and I was 16 years old, and I sat by myself.
Oh, mate.
And I sat by myself and watched that service. And then, 2 months later, it all comes out about what he's been doing. And I remember being so angry. And then the anger sort of, subsided when I felt like he got his comeuppance, when he got booted out. And I thought, you know what, I can sit back and then watch them tear themselves apart and I can enjoy this. But then listening to him, and this Trumpian sort of, disdain for political institutions and for justice, and just hearing him, throw it all aside and say that he doesn't agree with it. It's all just come back. I just speak all again.
Yeah, I know. I mean, I bet it has because it is almost beyond process. It is harder. You can usually get your head up. So politicians do bad things. Some of them fib, some of them don't. And then this fella comes along and just blew everything up in a way, didn't he? And those moments that people have, your memories of your great grandmother's funeral, other people, just thinking, how could that have been happening at the same time?
I know. You're absolutely right. And I mean, it's like when we watched, people talk about the Queen being sat by herself.
Yeah, of course.
And obviously not in front of the entire nation, but in a very similar situation, literally sitting by myself at an event.
You needed a cuddle, you needed an arm around your shoulders. If I were to help you with your A-level essay, I would go in on the institutions. So rather than the policy-based elements of it, I'd go in on the traditional conservatives. Whatever their policy positions might have been, they had enormous faith in the machinery of Parliament, in the institutions, the checks and balances. I'm just terrified it's going to come up now, Harry, and you're going to have said on the radio, "That's a rubbish question," and you'll blame me if it thinks so. That's where I'd go in hard on that. The traditional conservative position is to conserve the tradition, to conserve the institutions, to conserve the checks and balances. And what he's done, of course, is set fire to that. And people like Rees-Mogg, I think, probably too stupid to realise where he's left them. He's left them on the side of the arsonists, having set fire to the stuff he spent his whole life, as Rory Stewart explained earlier, his whole life professing to care about.
Absolutely. No, you're absolutely right. I mean, I'm just finished doing some revision on conservatism, and, I disagree with a lot of their ideology, but like you said, it's based on tradition and it's based on a respect for the country and for the nation, and he's got none of that.
That's nicely put. Nicely put. Harry, mate, I'm sorry for you being in a position to share that story, but I'm grateful to you for doing so. It's just gone 12:29, and good luck with the A-level, of course. You're listening to James O'Brien on LBC. Half an hour left before we hand over to Sheila. I wouldn't be staggered if she was returning to similar territory. A lot of you very moved by Robert Lindsay's words and his own emotions with regard to the passing of Glenda Jackson. That's important to note that. And then, I think we might now allow ourselves the question of, that's got to be it, hasn't it? And people texting me saying he only needs 18,000 votes in mid-beds. Nadine Dorries casting herself as the mid-beds blocker, which I thought was quite a felicitous turn of phrase. I just find this so egregious, that particularly the sort of hat trick, the triple whammy of contempt, starting with the one I shared with you when Ben Kentish was here, but then the contempt about the contempt, and the contempt about the contempt about the contempt. I don't think you're going to ring me if you're a forelock tugger. I accept that. I'm going to try in the coming years to rebuild the bridges of communication that have been blown up by the scale of your epic error, an error in large part motivated by your support or admiration of Boris Johnson. But if you know someone who's still there, Someone who's still waving their little flag, still claiming that he's a man more sinned against than sinning. What are they going to do now? Are they just going to stick their head in the sand and ignore all of the evidence, ignore all of the facts? To which you might reasonably respond by saying, well, that's what they've been doing so far, James. 12:30 is the time. Amelia Cox is here now with your headline. Here it is, 12:33 is the time. I'm not going to put my begging bowl down. If you are a massive or were a massive Boris Johnson fan, up to possibly today or last week or last month, I'd love to hear your confession on 0345 606 0973. If you still are, straight to the front of the queue. 0345 606 0973. Here's the evidence for the prosecution. So I read you the first bit, which, it is, when they've got 30,000 words, that there are no punishments or there's no shame in not getting across it all immediately. But this seems to me to be significant. I read you the first bit. The document he was given early look, as you know, at the report, and it was given to him with these words in capital letters across the top of it. Okay? Privileged and in strict confidence for the use of Mr. Johnson and his nominated legal advisors only. And he broke that confidence. So you can't defend that. Even if you don't like what's in the report, you can't defend the fact that he broke the confidence. All he had to do was wait until it was published and then he could offer up his response. But he broke that. And this is what they had to say about that. So that's a contempt. Simply breaking the confidence is a contempt. This, I think, compounds the contempt to such a degree that it becomes another contempt. You ready? They wrote this: "We note that Mr. Johnson does not merely criticise the fairness of the committee's procedures, he also attacks in very strong, indeed vitriolic terms, the integrity, honesty and honour of its members. He stated that the committee had, quotes, forced him out anti-democratically. This attack on a committee carrying out its remit from the democratically elected House itself amounts to an attack on our democratic institutions. We consider that these statements are completely unacceptable. In our view, this conduct, together with the egregious breach of confidentiality, is a serious further contempt." So that's two. And then the hat trick. Then along comes three, because as Ian Dunt has pointed out in Twitter analysis that I highly recommend, it goes on to suggest that he even lied to the committee about whether he had lied about the committee. We further note that these latest developments cast a new light on some of Mr. Johnson's previous comments and behaviour. This is what Ben Kentish pointed out to us. He essentially saw, well, I'll read you all of it. "We draw attention in paragraph 15 above to the attacks mounted on the committee in the media and by some politicians," I'm looking at you, Dorries and Rees-Mogg, "during the course of the inquiry, couched in terms of personal abuse of the committee's members. In public, Mr. Johnson held himself aloof from these attacks. When we questioned him about the attacks in the oral evidence session, he told us that he deprecated the use of language such as kangaroo courts and witch hunts. A matter of days after the evidence of session of 30th of March 2023, he wrote to us, he wrote to each individual member of the committee in his letter stating, I hope I made clear in those answers, I have the utmost respect for the integrity of the committee and all its members and the work that it is doing," literally and specifically disowning the phrases witch hunt and kangaroo court. "At the end of the session, Sir Charles and Mr. Coster asked me a series of questions regarding the comments that have been made about the committee's work being a witch hunt and a kangaroo court." Now, this is what the report has to say this morning. "Notwithstanding his protestations of respect for the committee and his earlier deprecation of language such as kangaroo courts and witch hunts, we note that in his statement of the 9th of June, i.e. Friday, Mr. Johnson himself used precisely those abusive terms to describe the committee. This leaves us in no doubt that he was insincere in his attempts to distance himself from the campaign of abuse and intimidation of committee members. This, in our view, constitutes a further significant contempt." So a hat trick of contempts built upon upon his breach of the confidentiality. And remember, when he was trying to disown it back in March, when he was trying to claim that he deprecated the use of language such as witch hunt and kangaroo court, the people using that language, witch hunt and kangaroo court, either appeared on his honours list or, in the case of poor old Nadine Dorries, expected to appear. So he cannot have been simultaneously deprecating the use of that language while planning to ennoble people who were using it. So, I mean, man, if I had to say, If I had to offer up a simple, and I think he's lost it this morning. I think he's gone completely off the edge, completely off the cliff, and he'll take some people with him, like Brendan Clark-Smith, and presumably Gullis is out there, is he? And 30p Lee, I don't know. They might be beginning to worry about their own prospects at the next election. But he's gone off the cliff, but he's got people in the boot. It's like Stan, isn't it? That Eminem track. But no, it's not even like that, because that poor girl couldn't get out of the boot. These people have jumped in the car entirely of their own volition while Johnson puts his foot to the floor and powers off the edge of a nearest cliff. Problem is, he's got a parachute. I'll stop these analogies now. They're getting a bit out of hand. Let's go to Craig, who's in Glasgow. Is it all over, Craig? Can we actually breathe a sigh of relief and relax a bit?
Afternoon, James. Well, I think Boris is toast in terms of having any real prominent role in politics again. But I do think that the threat of Boris will always exist, because for as long as he's got his sycophants out there, people like Nadine Dorries, and a system that allows people like her to hold a constituency hostage for their own selfish needs and gains, then that is always going to exist. Now, he may well go and start another party, but we've seen how well that's worked for Nigel Farage and Richard Tice and people of that ilk. It hasn't really got them very far, and I don't suspect he will either. But for me, I celebrate the fact that he is gone, and hopefully will stay gone. But I still think we are a long, long way away from ridding our institutions of the scourge, of the stains that people like him leave behind. Because right now, I don't think our political system resembles anything remotely close to being respectful in a system that we can hold up as a pinnacle in the world. It's farcical at times right now, and you've got a Prime Minister still, even now, even after this report, frightened to death to go too hard in on Boris in case some of his supporters have a go at him. I mean, it's ridiculous.
Well, they will. I don't know for sure, but I suspect even now, remember the membership, not the parliamentary membership, but the nationwide membership of the Conservative Party, put Liz Truss in Downing Street. And you are not talking about the sharpest knives in the national drawer here by any stretch of the imagination. So I wonder if the membership would still... The circumstances in which I can see a way back for him are... And I can't see how the first bit would happen, but the second bit would be that he is in a position to stand in an election that would be decided exclusively by the Conservative Party membership. I don't know how many of them he has newly alienated. I think if they were going to go, if they were going to lose faith, they would have lost it before today. So but if he set up a new party, what would the points of policy difference be? Would it be a Farage's project to promise things that were undeliverable? It just we'll bring back proper Brexit, or we'll do it again, or we'll find that excellent Brexit that goes to a different school and we'll drag it kicking and screaming. I don't see what he'd offer that the Tories weren't already offering, except me, Boris, me.
Well, yeah, I think that's pretty much what they would hope the selling point is. I mean, of course, they do completely ignore the fact that when he left office as Prime Minister, his approval rating was like minus 48. Yeah. So he wasn't exactly Mr. Popular at that time. I think that's what they would go for. But, part of the problem is, and who I hold quite highly responsible for this, are a lot of the people in the right-wing media and some of the mainstream media, because they've bolstered him so much that he's believed his own hype. When the Partygate thing was going on, and then Pinchergate, they kept saying, he'll survive this, it's Boris, nothing sticks to Boris, he's untouchable, he'll
he's
just
a winner.
Keep on going, he'll keep going. Yeah, and then when finally it catches up to him, and things like the Privileges Committee and obviously Pinchergate at the time, finally bite him in the backside, and people go, do you know what? Nah, enough. Now you will be held accountable. He's almost, livid that anybody would have the temerity
How dare
to question
they? How
the almighty Boris Johnson.
Dare they? Well, that's of a piece with what his teacher said, of course, back in the day, isn't it? About he thinks it is somehow churlish of us to expect him to abide by the whatever it was that the rest of us are bound by. I mean, from day one, it would appear that he has just considered the rules to be inconveniences or indeed it's things that apply to other people and never to him. Thank you, Craig. From Scotland to Wales, John's in Llanelli. John, what would you like to say?
Good morning. Thank you for taking my call this afternoon. Sorry, good afternoon. Thanks for taking my call.
You're more than welcome.
Without sounding like Uncle Albert, I served the country. I know.
You don't sound anything like Uncle Albert.
I served my country for 22 years as a soldier and 11 as a police officer. I've always believed in the maintenance of democracy, and it's one thing that I remained loyal to the Crown and indeed the government. Now I just wonder, oh my life, what have I done? I actually voted for Boris. You know, what's happening to our democracy? It's just totally undermined. I actually voted for Boris.
Yeah, but look at the effort that was put into persuading you that I voted for him in 2008. Seriously, don't beat yourself up about it. Millions of people voted for him. It was an astonishing election result. And you didn't know in 2019 the depth of how disgusting he is. How would you have known? No, hardly anyone was telling you. Present company accepted, obviously.
I mean, I've got to admit the entertainment value out of the man when you see him hanging on a roadside or whatever.
Exactly.
It was absolutely immense. And I just wonder how many people think out there wonder it was either the sort of better of a bad two.
In 2019? Loads of people.
Yeah.
Well, one was unelectable and one was utterly unconscionable. That was the failure of British democracy was to offer up that choice in 2019. And that's certainly not your fault. There's nothing that you could have done about that. When did I don't want to say when did the penny drop. That's a bit patronising. But when did you sort of reach the point of no return? When did you think, oh my God, no, I can't believe I ever did that? Do you see what I mean? Rather than 6 of one, half a dozen of the other type of reasoning.
I think as soon as the sort of allegations of Partygate came out, I started to wonder to myself, okay, well let's everything should be evidence based. Let's see what starts to come out. And as it built up and the media reported more and more, and I set great faith by the media. I thought to myself, well, there's something not quite right here. And as soon as that was when the penny started to drop. And again, I've waited and waited and waited until this point, and there's no contrition. There's just no sort of acceptance.
That's the first time that word has appeared on the programme this morning, and it's already 1:45. There is no contrition whatsoever. Not even he's not even pretending that he's sorry.
Exactly, and this is what I can't get over. That man governed us.
Yeah.
He governed us. Good grief, James. What is going on?
Well, it can only get better, he says, crossing everything and hoping for the best. Don't, whatever you do, though, John, don't ever go to a place where you wonder about the value of the service that you've provided to this country, because you're the kind of people we need to look to remind ourselves what proper service looks like. We've got Boris Johnson on the other side of those scales, so please let me say that to you. 12:46 is the time. You're listening to James O'Brien on LBC. Of course, 30,000 words. I don't think anyone would have read them all yet, would they? But here's a footnote you might like. We note that Mr. Johnson has recently undertaken to supply the COVID public inquiry with a large number of his personal WhatsApp messages. This contrasts with his highly restrictive release of such messages to us. If it transpires from examination of the WhatsApp messages supplied to the COVID inquiry that there was relevant material which should have been disclosed to us, either by Mr. Johnson or the Cabinet Office, this would be a serious matter which the House might need to revisit. So it's over, but it's not over, if you see what I mean. 10:01 is the time. You are listening to James O'Brien on LBC. I'm going to remind you of something that our erstwhile colleague Theo Usherwood picked up on a lot at the time, and a few of you like me. noting Theo's absence at a time like this, because he was such a crucial part of our political coverage through all of these times. I mean, delighted with the coverage that we've provided, of course, but it's nice sometimes, isn't it, to acknowledge absent friends. But he was adamant, to the point where I used to tease him about banging on about it all the time, that Starmer was setting traps and that Starmer's legal training was going to come back. And I was reminded of that, actually, when I was, earlier today, reminded of this.
Well, somebody here isn't telling the truth. The House will have heard the Prime Minister's answer, and I remind him the Ministerial Code says, and I quote, "Ministers who knowingly mislead Parliament will be expected to offer their resignation." I'll leave it there for now. Turning to another issue.
I'm going to play that again, because I can. But that's just it, isn't it? That's him knowing. Everybody knew. This is the thing about... Look, here's someone called James Duddridge, who's got KCMG MP on his Twitter profile, bless him. He says, why not go the full way? Put Boris in the stocks and providing rotten food to throw rotten food at him. Moving him around the marginals so the country could share in the humiliation. History will hold Boris in higher regard than this committee. I thank him for his service. It's a bit illiterate, isn't it? Very unhinged. But everybody knew. That was the point. Quite how he thought he could get away with it is easy to understand. His answer would be, I always have. I'll just do this and I'll do that, and then we'll get the response out before the report and there. But listen to, because Starmer knew, didn't he? He absolutely knew that he'd got him. It's just a question of how the net would close.
Well, somebody here isn't telling the truth. The House will have heard the Prime Minister's answer, and I remind him the Ministerial Code says, and I quote, "Ministers who knowingly mislead Parliament will be expected to offer their resignation." I'll leave it there for now. Turning to another issue.
He should have done a pantomime laugh at that point, shouldn't he? He should go, I'll leave it there for now. No, maybe not. From the sublime to the ridiculous. Have a listen to this from J-Dog, from the penny farthing in human form, and see if you can spot the obvious problem with what he's whining about this morning.
It seems that kind of the kind of guardrails, if you like, or the lines are set in this, and that Boris Johnson supporters are not going to be moved to find another position on the findings of this report. But just to be clear before we move on, when it comes to Harriet Harman, you believe that if she had recused herself, the committee would have had more legitimacy?
Oh, definitely. If you had found a Labour MP who had made no comment about Boris Johnson, that would have established a committee with considerably more authority.
He still, have you done the little bit? He still sounds so confident. This is... My goodness me. Just listen to that bit again, the last bit. Great questioning from Beth Rigby. Just listen to the steaming pile, honestly.
Oh, definitely. If you had found a Labour MP who had made no comment about Boris Johnson, that would have established a committee with considerably more authority.
Oh, God almighty. So, yes, right you are, Jacob. Yeah, a Labour MP who's not said anything about Boris Johnson. That's exactly. I mean, you're not supposed to say it out loud, Jacob. What we need on this committee is a Labour MP who's never said. What we need is an opposition MP who doesn't do any opposition. We need a Labour MP who's never opposed any. Just compare those two politicians in many ways, and I am replete with reservations about Keir Starmer. Don't be under any illusions about that. He's carrying a Ming vase across an ice rink at the moment, but what he does with the contents of the vase when he gets to the other side remains to be seen. But you will rarely get a starker contrast in political acumen and political skill. You have a leader of the opposition essentially throwing a net around the Prime Minister here and not knowing when the net will tighten, but being supremely confident that one day it would.
Oh, definitely. If you had found a Labour MP who had made no comment...
When I say the leader of the opposition, obviously I'm referring to the leader of the opposition.
Well, somebody here isn't telling the truth. The House will have heard the Prime Minister's answer, and I remind him the Ministerial Code says, and I quote, "Ministers who knowingly mislead Parliament will be expected to offer their resignation." I'll leave it there for now. Turning to another issue.
And then you have Jacob Rees-Mogg, Sir Jacob Rees-Mogg to you, Sir Jacob Rees-Mogg, offering up his opinion on the sort of Labour politician who might have delivered the the verdict of innocence that Jacob Rees-Mogg was hoping for?
Oh, definitely. If you had found a Labour MP who had made no comment about Boris Johnson, that would have established a committee with considerably more authority.
It's not Mystery Hour. We curtailed Mystery Hour this week. It'll be back next week, all being well. Sheila Fogarty's in the studio. Can you think of any Labour MPs who've never made a comment about Boris Johnson, Sheila?
I doubt there are any. I doubt there are any.
Oh, ye of little faith. How dare you? Who knows?
The dead ones.
Well, yeah, probably. That might have worked. Quick word from Ben in Newport in South Wales on this one. Ben, what made you pick up the phone?
Yeah, hi, James. I've been listening to your show all morning, and all the callers have, expressed their anger and, rage at, Boris Johnson's conduct over his, premiership. And I just think that it's an expert tactic that he's used to, deflect people's rage into places where it isn't
always
deserved.
Yeah, good point. It's like steam, isn't it? You get the anger, get the rage going in a different direction. Do you think that's it now? Do you think that is now toast territory?
I really, really hope it is, but I'm sceptical that he's been shown to be a successful politician in terms of holding power and winning elections. And there's a lot of people who would see that and try to replicate his behaviour.
Yes, yeah. Well, there you go. A word of caution, actually, towards the end. That notion that others may come along and actually emulate him in the hope of securing power. And last word of the day is to Ant in Oxford. Ant, what's it going to be?
Hi, James. It's just to say how to be wrong. I was so glad I was wrong. I rang you a few years ago, just after the COVID jabs, and I was in the queue, and everybody was saying, good old Boris, good old Boris. And I rang you saying he's in for 10 or 15 years. This is Falklands War.
Gosh.
And I don't know if you remember it.
I do remember it. I didn't expect you to ring in today, though.
No, I just thought I had to say how wrong I was, basically. And that's
good
it.
for you.
I'm a Labour supporter, but...
I know. Just reading the room. But, also pessimism, I think, kicking into your... what do you think swung it? Just this business today? I mean, the whole revelations.
Swung it?
The parties.
The parties, it just all caught up with them in the end, didn't it?
And they're still telling us to move on. Still, I presume they are. I tend to zone them out a little bit now. It is coming up to 12:59. Don't you think that clip you played of Keir Starmer rather undermines Dawn Butler's claim that the opposition didn't do enough to hold Johnson to account? That's not what she said, actually, Annette. It was more a case that the opposition could be doing more now to address and seek to redress many of the problems sweeping the country. If you missed any of today's show, you can listen back on Catch Up on Global Player, where you can, of course, rewind live radio and enjoy the whole show podcast. You'll also find all of LBC's shows to catch up on the seashore, as well as staying up to date with the latest news from LBC. Rewind live radio on Global Player. Download for free from your app store or head to globalplayer.com. Tom Sawbrick with you at 4, and now with a 3-hour special on e-scooters, it's Sheila Fogarty.
Absolutely. Been dying to talk about the phrases. 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 Dying to talk about the phrases.